Power doesn't announce itself with trumpets or gilded proclamations. It walks into a room and every conversation dies mid-sentence. Duke Cassian Viramont stood in the doorway of his own estate, blood on his knuckles and murder in his eyes, while the woman he'd claimed as his watched her husband's world crumble like ash. This wasn't love. This was conquest. And if you want to see how far a man will go when betrayal cuts deeper than any blade, when obsession becomes the only law that matters, then stay with me until the end. Drop your city in the comments. Hit that like button, because what happens next will redefine everything you thought you knew about power, possession, and the fine line between salvation and damnation. London existed in layers. The glittering surface where champagne flowed and laughter echoed through marble halls. The shadowed underbelly where debts were called and reputations destroyed. And then there was the space between where men like Cassian Viramont operated with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of an executioner. The Hartwell Ball was one of those tedious affairs the aristocracy treated like oxygen, necessary but unremarkable. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across silk gowns and tailored suits. Conversations hummed with the practiced cadence of people saying nothing while meaning everything. Cassian stood near the terrace doors, a glass of whiskey in hand he hadn't touched, watching the performance with the detachment of a predator studying prey. He didn't belong to their world, not really. His title was old, his wealth older, but he'd never played by their rules. Where they negotiated, he dictated. Where they schemed, he acted. The aristocracy tolerated him because they feared him, and fear was the only currency that mattered. Lord Edmund Alcott held court near the center of the room, his laugh too loud, his gestures too expansive. A man trying desperately to convince everyone, including himself, that he mattered. Cassian had known men like Edmund his entire life. Inherited wealth masking inherited weakness. Titles covering incompetence. They were parasites dressed in ermine, and the world bent itself into knots pretending otherwise. But it wasn't Edmund that held Cassian's attention. It was the woman standing 3 steps behind him, a ghost in emerald silk. Lady Seraphine Alcott. Edmund's wife, his possession. His proof of respectability in a life built on corruption and excess. She stood with perfect posture, her hands folded, her expression composed in that particular way women learned when survival depended on invisibility. She smiled when required, nodded when addressed, existed in the spaces between other people's importance. Cassian saw her, and something shifted. Not desire, though that would come. Not pity, because he didn't traffic in weakness. It was recognition. The understanding that beneath her carefully constructed facade was something buried alive, something fighting for air in a coffin built by expectation and reinforced by cruelty. He wanted it, wanted her, wanted to pry open that coffin and see what emerged. Mine. The word formed in his mind with the weight of absolute certainty. Not a question, not a negotiation, a declaration of intent that would reshape everything in its path. Cassian set down his glass and crossed the ballroom floor. The crowd parted without conscious thought, some primal instinct recognizing the shift in atmospheric pressure. Edmund was mid-story, something about parliament and fiscal policy that no one actually cared about when Cassian's shadow fell across him. Edmund's voice faltered. His smile froze in that awkward space between confidence and uncertainty. "Good evening, Alcott," Cassian said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried the authority of a judge reading a sentence. Edmund recovered with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to pretending everything was fine. "Viramont. Didn't expect to see you here. Thought these gatherings were beneath your notice. Most things are." Cassian's gaze shifted, landing on Seraphine with the weight of a physical touch. "Lady Alcott, you look exquisite tonight." She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds before lowering her gaze. Protocol. The proper response of a married woman acknowledging a compliment from another man. But in those 2 seconds, Cassian saw everything. The intelligence she'd learned to hide. The exhaustion she carried like a second skin. The flicker of something almost like hope before she crushed it back into submission. "You're too kind, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was smooth, practiced, utterly hollow. Edmund's hand found the small of her back, possessive and casual. "My wife is the jewel of my collection," he said, and the phrasing made Cassian's jaw tighten. "Though I'm surprised you noticed. Thought you preferred more solitary pursuits." The implication hung in the air. Cassian's reputation preceded him. No wife, no mistress, no entanglements that might suggest vulnerability. He'd built his empire on the principle that attachment was weakness, that the only reliable constant was power. Until now. I notice everything worth noticing, Cassian replied. He turned his attention back to Edmund, and his smile was the kind that made seasoned negotiators reconsider their positions. We should speak, Alcott, about your recent investments. Edmund's confidence cracked at the edges. My investments are private matters. Nothing is private when it involves my banks. The statement landed like a blade. Around them, conversations continued, but several people had shifted their attention, vultures sensing blood in the water. Edmund's face reddened, a flush of anger and embarrassment spreading up his neck. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating fact. Your debt portfolio reads like a suicide note. We'll discuss it tomorrow. My office, 10 o'clock. It wasn't a request. Edmund opened his mouth to protest, but Cassian had already turned away, his attention settling once more on Seraphine. She was watching him now, that carefully neutral expression showing the first hairline cracks of genuine emotion, confusion, wariness, and underneath it all the smallest spark of something that might have been curiosity. Lady Alcott, Cassian said, extending his hand, would you honor me with a dance? Protocol demanded she accept. Propriety required it. But they both knew this wasn't about social niceties. This was a statement, a claim being made in full view of London's elite. Seraphine glanced at Edmund, seeking permission she shouldn't have needed. He nodded, tight-lipped, trapped by the same rules he used to control her. Her hand settled in Cassian's, and the contact was electric. He led her onto the floor as a waltz began, his hand finding her waist with possessive certainty. Up close, he could see the details she hid from the world. The faint bruise along her collarbone, carefully covered with powder, the tension in her shoulders, the way her breathing was just slightly too controlled, like a woman constantly bracing for impact. They moved through the first rotation in silence. Cassian didn't believe in small talk, and Seraphine seemed incapable of it. Around them, other couples swirled and chattered, but they existed in a bubble of charged quiet. Finally, she spoke. Why did you do that? Do what? Humiliate my husband in public. I stated a fact. If he finds truth humiliating, that's his failing, not mine. Her eyes flashed, the first genuine emotion breaking through her mask. You don't know anything about him, about us. I know he's drowning in debt. I know he's mortgaged your future to fund his present. I know he hits you when he's drunk and pretends it's discipline when he's sober. Cassian's voice never rose, never hardened, but each word landed with surgical precision. So tell me, Lady Alcott, what exactly don't I know? She missed a step, her composure shattering. How? I make it my business to know everything about people who owe me money. He pulled her closer, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper. But you're not part of his debt. You're separate. And I don't leave valuable things in the hands of incompetent men. I'm not a thing, she said, and there was steel beneath the tremor in her voice. No, you're not. You're a woman who's been treated like one for so long you've forgotten the difference. Cassian's gaze held hers, unwavering. I'm going to change that. You can't. I can. I will. The only question is whether you'll fight me or help me. The music swelled toward its conclusion. Seraphine stared at him, her mind clearly racing through possibilities and implications. This wasn't a rescue. This wasn't kindness. This was something far more dangerous, a force of nature with her name on it. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this? Because I want to. And what I want, I take. The waltz ended. Cassian released her, stepping back with a slight bow that was more mockery than respect. He could feel Edmund's glare from across the room, could sense the shift in the crowd's attention. Scandal was brewing, and he'd lit the match with deliberate intent. Thank you for the dance, Lady Alcott, he said, loud enough for nearby couples to hear. I look forward to our next encounter. He walked away without waiting for a response, leaving her standing alone on the dance floor, her world already beginning to crack at the foundations. The meeting in Cassian's office the next morning was brutal in its efficiency. Edmund arrived 15 minutes late, a power play that Cassian allowed because it revealed everything about the man's desperation. He wore his best suit and his worst attitude, the combination of someone who knew they were outmatched but refused to admit it. Cassian sat behind a desk that cost more than Edmund's annual income, surrounded by files and documents that represented the full weight of his financial empire. He didn't offer Edmund a seat. "You're 37,000 pounds in debt," Cassian said without preamble, "spread across 4 creditors, all of whom I've acquired in the last month. You've been gambling on shipping investments that haven't materialized and property developments that will never break ground. Your estate is mortgaged to the ceiling. Your liquid assets wouldn't cover a quarter of what you owe." Edmund's face went white, then red, cycling through the stages of a man confronting inescapable truth. Those are confidential matters. They were. Now they're mine." Cassian leaned back in his chair, studying Edmund with the clinical interest of an entomologist examining a particularly pathetic insect. "You have 2 options. Option 1, I call in your debts immediately. You lose everything: the estate, the title's reputation, your seat in society. You'll be fortunate to avoid debtor's prison. And option 2? Cassian smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd already won. Option 2. You give me what I want, and I restructure your debt into something manageable. You keep your estate, your standing, and your dignity, such as it is." Edmund's hands clenched into fists. "What do you want?" "Your wife." The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Edmund stared at Cassian, his mouth working soundlessly, his brain clearly struggling to process the magnitude of what had just been said. You can't be serious. I'm always serious when it comes to acquiring assets." Cassian stood, moving to the window that overlooked London's financial district. "I want Lady Seraphine released from her marriage. Quietly. Discreetly. A mutual dissolution based on irreconcilable differences. You'll maintain that it was a joint decision. You'll speak of her with nothing but respect. And in return, I'll ensure you survive your own stupidity. She's my wife. She's a woman you've beaten, belittled, and broken for 5 years." Edmund's voice cracked with indignation. "And you've just offered to sell her like livestock to settle your gambling debts. So spare me the outrage. This is insane. Even for you, Viermont, society will accept whatever story I tell them to accept. I own half the newspapers in London and hold debts on the other half. If I say your marriage ended amicably, that's what history will record." Cassian turned back to face Edmund, and his expression was carved from granite. "The only question is whether you're smart enough to take the escape I'm offering, or stupid enough to fight a battle you've already lost." Edmund's breath came in short, angry bursts. His pride warred with his survival instinct, and for a moment Cassian wondered if he'd actually be foolish enough to refuse. Then Edmund's shoulders sagged, defeat settling over him like a shroud. "Fine," he said, the word barely audible. "But I want it in writing, the debt restructuring, all of it. You'll have it by end of day." Cassian moved back to his desk, pulling out a document he'd had prepared before Edmund even arrived. "Sign this. It's a preliminary agreement that you won't contest the dissolution." Edmund didn't read it. He just grabbed the pen and scrawled his signature with the defeated fury of a man signing away the last thing he could control. When it was done, Cassian took the document and filed it away with casual precision. "One more thing," he said. "If you touch her again, if you say one word to her that isn't respectful, if you even look at her wrong in the time it takes to finalize this arrangement, I will destroy you so completely that your name will become a cautionary tale whispered in the gutters. Are we clear?" Edmund's jaw worked, but he nodded. "Get out." Edmund fled, and Cassian watched him go with the satisfaction of a chess master removing an unnecessary piece from the board. The hard part was done. Edmund was handled, the debt restructured, the path cleared. Now came the part that actually mattered. Seraphine. Chapat. She didn't come to him. He'd expected that. What he wanted required pursuit, required the deliberate dismantling of every defense she'd built to survive her marriage. So Cassian went to her. Alcott House was a monument to faded grandeur, all Georgian columns and manicured gardens hiding the rot underneath. Cassian arrived unannounced, dismissing the butler's protests with the kind of authority that made objections pointless. He found Seraphine in the library, surrounded by books she probably wasn't allowed to read, and thoughts she definitely wasn't allowed to voice. She looked up as he entered, and her expression cycled through surprise, alarm, and something that might have been resignation. "You shouldn't be here," she said, standing quickly. "Edmund is currently drinking himself into oblivion at his club, having just signed away any claim to you." Cassian closed the distance between them with measured steps. We need to talk, Seraphine. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it made her flinch. Don't call me that. Why not? It's your name. It's not yours to use. She moved behind a chair, putting furniture between them like a barrier. What did you do to him? I gave him a choice. He made it. What choice? Ruin or survival? He chose survival, as any coward would. Her hands gripped the chair back so hard her knuckles went white. You can't just... People aren't transactions. You can't buy and sell them like... I didn't buy you. I freed you. There's a difference. Free? She laughed, and it was a broken, bitter sound. You've just traded one cage for another. One man owning me for a different man owning me. How is that freedom? Because I'm giving you a choice he never did. Cassian moved around the chair, closing the distance despite her retreat. I'm not asking you to stay with me. I'm asking you to leave him. What happens after is entirely up to you. She stared at him, searching for the lie, the manipulation, the hidden price. But Cassian's face showed nothing but absolute certainty. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this? Because I saw you standing in that ballroom, dying by inches, while everyone pretended you were fine. Because I watched you smile through cruelty and call it duty. Because you deserve better than a man who treats you like furniture. Cassian's voice was quiet, but each word carried the weight of unshakable conviction. And because I want you, not as a possession, as a choice you make for yourself. Tears welled in her eyes, and she fought them back with desperate control. You don't know me. You don't know anything about... I know you're brilliant, and you've had to hide it. I know you're strong, and you've had to pretend weakness. I know you've survived 5 years of hell by convincing yourself it was normal. Cassian reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat, and touched her cheek with unexpected gentleness. I know you're not broken, Seraphine. You're just convinced you are. And I'm going to prove you wrong. A single tear escaped, running down her cheek to meet his thumb. I'm afraid, she said, and the admission cost her everything. Good. Fear means you're still alive. Fear means you haven't given up. Cassian's hand moved to cup her face, his touch firm but not forceful. I'm not him. I won't hurt you. I won't diminish you. I won't make you small to make myself feel large. Then what will you do? I'll show you what power actually means. Not control. Not domination. Protection. Choice. The ability to say no and have it matter. Cassian's gaze held hers, unwavering. Come with me. Leave this house, this life, this pretense of respectability that's killing you. And if you decide later that I'm not what you want, I'll help you build whatever life you choose. You're asking me to trust you. No, I'm asking you to trust yourself. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and consequence. In the distance, a clock chimed the hour. Outside, London continued its eternal dance of commerce and scandal. Seraphine closed her eyes, and when she opened them, something had shifted. Some fundamental choice made in the space between heartbeats. All right, she said. The word was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of revolution. Cassian smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes. Pack what matters. We leave tonight. The scandal erupted exactly as Cassian had planned. Within 48 hours, every drawing room in London buzzed with the news. Lady Seraphine Alcott had left her husband. Duke Viramont was involved. The details varied depending on who was telling the story, but the core remained consistent. One of the most powerful men in England had claimed another man's wife, and society was eating itself alive trying to decide how to respond. Cassian installed Seraphine in one of his London properties, a townhouse in Mayfair that made Alcott House look like a servant's cottage. He gave her her own wing, her own staff, and the one thing Edmund had never offered, privacy. She didn't know what to do with it. The first week, she barely left her rooms. Cassian didn't push. He'd spent his life reading people, understanding the precise amount of pressure required to shape outcomes without shattering them. Seraphine needed time to remember how to exist without constant surveillance and judgment. He sent her books, not romantic novels or feminine treatises on proper behavior, but philosophy, economics, political theory, the kind of texts women weren't supposed to read because they might start thinking for themselves. She devoured them. On the 8th day, she emerged. Cassian was in his study, reviewing contracts that would reshape 3 companies and displace 200 workers who'd been skimming profits for years, when she knocked. He'd never heard her knock before. Edmund's house had taught her to enter silently, to make herself invisible. "Come in." She stepped through the doorway and he saw the transformation beginning. She wore a simple dress, no corset crushing her ribs, no elaborate styling hiding her face. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and her eyes held something they hadn't before. Clarity. "We need to talk," she said. Cassian set down his pen. "Always." She moved to the chair across from his desk, sitting with the careful control of someone still learning they were allowed to take up space. "You said I had choices, that I could decide what happens next. I did. And you do. Then I need to understand what you want from me. Really want. Not the pretty story about freedom and protection. What's the price of all this?" The question would have offended a lesser man. Cassian appreciated it. "There's no price, Seraphine. I don't deal in debts when it comes to people I actually care about. But you want something. Everyone wants something. Yes. I want you to stop being afraid. I want you to remember who you were before Edmund spent 5 years convincing you to forget. I want to see what happens when you're allowed to exist without constantly calculating the cost of every word and action." Cassian leaned forward, his gaze intense. "And yes, eventually, I want you. All of you. But not until you're ready to choose it freely." Her breath caught. "And if I'm never ready?" "Then you'll still have your freedom, your protection, and my resources to build whatever life you want." Cassian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I didn't save you to own you, Seraphine. I claimed you to keep you safe while you remembered how to save yourself." She studied him for a long moment, and he could see her mind working through implications and possibilities. This was the woman Edmund had tried to bury. Sharp, analytical, unafraid to ask hard questions. "You're terrifying," she said finally. "Good. So are you. You've just forgotten how powerful fear can be when you're the one wielding it." A smile ghosted across her lips, there and gone. "I don't know how to do this, any of this. Then we'll figure it out together." Cassian stood, moving around the desk to sit on its edge, closer to her but not crowding. No rules except honesty. No expectations except that you stop pretending to be less than you are. And no going back to Edmund, no matter how hard society pushes. Society is already pushing. She looked down at her hands. "The invitations have stopped. The few friends I had won't acknowledge me. I'm being erased. You're being filtered. The weak ones are falling away. The real ones will hold. And the ones who matter are the ones you'll build yourself." Cassian's voice carried absolute certainty. Edmund's world was built on appearances and obligations. Mine is built on power and results. You'll find the second much more honest. She looked up at him, and he saw the question forming before she asked it. "What happens when they come for you? When Parliament or the courts or whatever forces you've offended decide to push back? They already have. They've been trying to destroy me for 15 years. I'm still here. They're not. Arrogance or fact? Both." Cassian's smile was sharp as a blade. "I don't lose, Seraphine, not when it matters. And you matter." The air between them charged with something unspoken, something dangerous and inevitable. Seraphine stood slowly, moving closer until only inches separated them. "Show me," she said. "Show you what? What power actually means. How to stop being afraid. How to be the person I was before. Before everything." Cassian reached out, his hand finding hers with deliberate care. "It means saying no. It means drawing lines and defending them. It means understanding that kindness without strength is just performance, and strength without purpose is just cruelty." He pulled her closer, slowly enough that she could retreat if she wanted. She didn't. It means knowing your value and refusing to negotiate it down to make other people comfortable. It means choosing your battles and winning the ones that matter. His other hand came up to her face, tilting her chin so their eyes met. And it means never, ever letting someone make you small, because they're too weak to handle how bright you actually burn. Her breath was coming faster now, her control cracking at the edges. "I don't know if I can be that person." "You already are. You've just been hiding it to survive. Now you don't have to hide anymore." The kiss, when it came, was not gentle. It was claiming and being claimed, power meeting power. Two people who'd spent their lives in control, finally surrendering to something they couldn't command. When they broke apart, Seraphine was breathing hard, her composure completely shattered. "Oh God, no. Just me." Cassian's smile was predatory and pleased. And that's where we'll stop for now. Because the next time we do this, I want you absolutely certain it's what you want. She stared at him, arousal and frustration warring across her face. You're serious, completely. I told you, Seraphine, I don't take what isn't freely given, and right now you're still figuring out what freedom means. He stepped back, putting distance between them with visible effort. Go. Read. Think. Learn who you are when no one's watching. When you're ready, you know where to find me. She left without another word, and Cassian watched her go with satisfaction. She was beginning to remember herself, to shake off the persona Edmund had forced her into. It would take time. It would take patience. But the woman emerging from that chrysalis of trauma and suppression would be worth every moment. And when she finally chose him, truly chose him with full knowledge and consent, it would be absolute. I typed. 2 weeks later, Edmund made his first mistake. He showed up at Cassian's townhouse drunk, belligerent, and desperate. The butler tried to turn him away, but Edmund forced his way past with the reckless energy of a man who'd lost everything and decided rage was better than acceptance. Cassian was in his study when Edmund burst through the door. You ruined me! Edmund's voice was slurred but venomous. Took everything. My wife, my reputation, my life. Cassian didn't stand, didn't even set down the document he was reviewing. I gave you a choice. You made it. Now live with the consequences. She's mine. She's my wife. Edmund lurched forward, stumbling over his own feet. You don't have the right. I have every right. You signed it away. Cassian finally looked up, and his expression was carved from ice. And she was never yours. She was trapped with you. There's a difference. I'll fight this. I'll take you to court. You'll do nothing. Because if you pursue this, I'll make public every sordid detail of your debts, your gambling, your visits to brothels while she waited at home thinking you were at Parliament. Cassian's voice never rose, but it cut like a razor. I'll paint such a vivid picture of your failures that your name will become synonymous with pathetic. Is that really what you want? Edmund's face went purple with rage. You think you're untouchable. You think you can take whatever you want and face no consequences. But you're wrong. Society won't stand for this. The law won't. The law is written by men I own. Society is controlled by people who owe me favors or fear my retaliation. You're shouting at clouds, Edmund. Now get out before I have you removed. Give her back. No. The single word dropped like a gavel. Edmund stared at Cassian with hatred so pure it was almost impressive. Then I'll make you regret this, Edmund spat. I'll make her regret it. He didn't finish the threat because Cassian was suddenly standing, his movement so fast and violent that Edmund actually stumbled backward. Listen to me very carefully, Cassian said, his voice quiet and absolutely lethal. If you threaten her, if you approach her, if you send her so much as a letter, I will bury you so deep that archaeologists won't find your bones. This isn't a negotiation. This isn't a warning. This is me telling you the immutable laws of physics that now govern your existence. She is under my protection. Touch her, and I will end you. Edmund opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Whatever bravado the alcohol had provided evaporated in the face of Cassian's absolute certainty. Now get the fuck out of my house. Edmund fled, and Cassian stood in his study listening to the front door slam with the satisfaction of having drawn a line and knowing it would hold. But the encounter left him unsettled, not because Edmund posed any real threat. The man was impotent in every sense that mattered, but because it revealed something Cassian hadn't wanted to acknowledge. His feelings for Seraphine had moved beyond strategy, beyond acquisition. This wasn't about claiming a prize or winning a battle. He cared. Genuinely, deeply, dangerously cared. And for a man who'd built his empire on the principle that attachment was weakness, that was the most terrifying development of all. Seraphine found him on the terrace an hour later, staring out at London's lights with the stillness of a man wrestling with thoughts he couldn't command into submission. Edmund was here, she said, not a question. Yes. What did he want? The impossible. Cassian didn't turn. To undo choices already made, to reclaim what was never his to begin with. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could feel her presence, but not touching. Are you all right? The question surprised him. When was the last time someone had asked that? When was the last time it would have mattered if they had? I threatened to destroy him if he came near you again, Cassian said. I meant it. I know. Does that frighten you, that I'm willing to go that far? Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a complexity he was still learning to read. No. What frightens me is how much I want you to. He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and saw a woman transformed. Still healing, still finding her footing, but no longer the ghost who'd stood in Edmund's shadow, pretending she didn't exist. You're changing, he said. Yes. Because you won't let me hide anymore. She met his gaze steadily. Because being around you makes me remember that I used to have opinions, thoughts, desires beyond just surviving the next day. Good. Is it? She moved closer, and there was challenge in her posture now. Because the woman I'm becoming might be more than you bargained for, might want things you're not prepared to give, such as equality, partnership, not worship, not subservience, actual respect. Seraphine's chin lifted. You've given me freedom from Edmund. But what happens when I use that freedom to demand the same from you? Cassian felt something ignite in his chest, hot and fierce and utterly unexpected. Then I'll give it to you, he said, because a woman who knows her worth is infinitely more valuable than one who's been convinced she has none. You say that now, but what happens when I disagree with you? When I push back? When I demand you justify your decisions instead of just accepting them? Then we'll fight, we'll argue, we'll find the edges of each other's boundaries and probably crash through a few of them. Cassian reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. But I'd rather have you as an equal who challenges me than a possession who only exists to validate me. You mean that? I never say things I don't mean. It's inefficient. She laughed, and the sound was genuine, unguarded. You're the strangest man I've ever met. I'm the only one who's ever been honest with you about what he wants and why he wants it. That's true. She squeezed his hand. Edmund wanted me because I came with good breeding and better connections, a trophy to prove he'd made it. You want me because you're brilliant and fierce, and when you finally stop apologizing for taking up space, you're going to be unstoppable. Cassian pulled her closer. Because I look at you and see not what you are, but what you could be if someone stopped trying to make you smaller. Because, he paused, the admission harder than any negotiation he'd ever navigated. Because I've spent my entire life alone, by choice and by design. And then I saw you, and suddenly alone felt like a punishment instead of a strength. Seraphine's breath caught, her eyes searching his face for the lie, the manipulation. But Cassian's expression was open in a way it never was, vulnerable in a way he'd sworn he'd never allow. This is insane, she whispered. Probably. We've known each other less than a month. Irrelevant. Society will never accept this. Society can burn. She stared at him, and he could see her cycling through every logical argument, every rational objection. Then she kissed him, and logic became irrelevant. This time, when they broke apart, neither of them retreated. I'm not ready, she said, for everything. Not yet. I know, but I'm getting there. Slowly. One choice at a time. Good. Cassian's smile was soft, genuine. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. They stood together on the terrace as London hummed below them, two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of broken expectations and emerging from it as something neither had anticipated. Power, Cassian had always believed, was the only currency that mattered. But standing there with Seraphine's hand in his, he realized he'd been wrong. Power was the tool, choice was the currency, and he'd just given her all of his. The first meeting of Seraphine's new life came 3 days later in the form of Lady Victoria Hartford, one of the few women in London's elite who'd maintained contact despite the scandal. They met for tea at Cassian's townhouse, and he made himself scarce, understanding that Seraphine needed to navigate this on her own terms. You look different, Victoria said, studying Seraphine with the sharp eyes of someone who missed nothing. I feel different. The Duke treating you well? Seraphine smiled, and it was real. He's treating me like a person. After 5 years with Edmund, that feels revolutionary. Victoria leaned forward, her voice dropping. You know what they're saying. I can imagine. They're calling you his mistress. his kept woman, saying you traded one man's bed for another's. Seraphine felt the old impulse to shrink, to defend, to make herself smaller in response to judgment. Then she remembered Cassian's words, his absolute certainty that she was worth more than other people's opinions. Let them say it, she replied evenly. I know the truth. The people who matter know the truth. Everyone else is just noise. Victoria's eyebrows rose. My God, you have changed. Yes. I'm remembering how to be the person I was before I convinced myself that survival meant silence. Seraphine met her friend's gaze. I won't apologize for choosing myself over a marriage that was killing me. And if that makes me scandalous, so be it. Good for you. Victoria's smile was genuine. Though I should warn you, Edmund's been talking, trying to salvage what's left of his reputation by painting you as unfaithful and ungrateful. Of course he is. It's easier than admitting he drove me away through cruelty and neglect. Viermont won't let that stand. No, he won't. Seraphine felt a warmth spread through her chest at the certainty. He's already made it clear that anyone who maligns me answers to him. You love him. It wasn't a question, and Seraphine found she couldn't deny it. I think I'm starting to, which is terrifying because I don't know if I even understand what love is when it's not wrapped in obligation and fear. Love isn't supposed to be comfortable, Victoria said softly. It's supposed to challenge you, push you, make you better than you were alone. Is that what you have with Hartford? God, no, Victoria laughed. We have an arrangement built on mutual respect in separate bedrooms. But I see something in your eyes when you talk about Viermont, something alive. Don't let fear of being hurt again kill that. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but Seraphine carried Victoria's words with her like a talisman. That night, she found Cassian in his study again, surrounded by the machinery of empire that he wielded with such casual precision. Can I ask you something? She said from the doorway. Always. Why aren't you married? Why no wife, no family, no heir to continue whatever dynasty you're building? Cassian set down his pen, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because marriage, as our world understands it, is a transaction. Property and titles exchanged for legitimacy and heirs. I've never been interested in transactions when it comes to partnership. But you want partnership. With the right person, yes. With someone who sees power as a shared resource rather than a zero-sum game. He looked at her. Someone who wouldn't try to change me, but would insist I be the best version of myself. Someone who... He trailed off, but they both knew how the sentence ended. Someone like me, Seraphine finished. Yes. She moved into the room, her courage building with each step. I'm not there yet. I'm still learning how to exist without constantly calculating the cost of every breath. But I want to be. I want to become the woman who can stand beside you without flinching. You already are that woman. You're just convincing yourself otherwise. Then help me see it. Help me become who I was meant to be before Edmund spent 5 years teaching me to disappear. Cassian stood, closing the distance between them. That's exactly what I intend to do, starting now. He pulled out a folder from his desk drawer, thick with documents. This is everything about Edmund. His debts, his crimes, his mistresses, his illegal business dealings. Enough to destroy him completely if it ever became public. Seraphine stared at the folder, her heart racing. I'm giving it to you, Cassian said. All of it. What you do with it is entirely your choice. Burn it. Use it. Let it gather dust. The power is yours. Why? Because you need to know you have it, that you're not powerless, that if he ever comes for you again, you have the ammunition to end him. Cassian placed the folder in her hands. Power isn't just about having strength. It's about knowing you have options. Seraphine looked down at the folder, feeling its weight, both literal and metaphorical. This is more than ammunition. This is nuclear. Yes, use it wisely. She clutched the folder to her chest, overwhelmed by the magnitude of trust he'd just placed in her. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just promise me something. What? Promise me you'll never again let someone convince you that you deserve less than everything. Seraphine felt tears prick her eyes, but this time she didn't fight them. I promise. They stood together in the study, surrounded by the trappings of power and prestige. And for the first time in her life, Seraphine felt like she belonged in spaces that had always treated her like an accessory. The transformation wasn't complete. There were still wounds to heal, still fears to overcome, still moments when she'd instinctively make herself small before remembering she didn't have to anymore. But she was getting there. one choice at a time, one moment of courage building on the last. And with Cassian beside her, showing her what partnership actually meant when stripped of society's poisonous expectations, she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could become the woman she'd always been meant to be. The woman who didn't ask permission to exist. The woman who knew her worth and refused to negotiate it. The woman who could stand in the fire and emerge tempered instead of broken. That night, as London slept and shadows played across the walls, Seraphine made a decision. She walked to Cassian's bedroom, her heart pounding, her resolve solid. He answered her knock immediately, unsurprised, as if he'd been waiting. "I'm ready," she said. "Are you sure?" "No, but I'm choosing anyway. Isn't that what freedom means?" Cassian smiled, and it was full of promise and heat and absolute certainty. "Yes," he said, pulling her inside. "That's exactly what it means." The door closed behind them, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, Seraphine stopped being the woman Edmund had tried to destroy and became something infinitely more dangerous. A woman who knew her power, a woman who'd chosen it freely, a woman who would burn down anyone who tried to take it away. And somewhere across London, Edmund Alcott sat in his empty estate, drowning in whiskey and regret, completely unaware that the story he'd started was about to reach a conclusion he could never have anticipated. Because the woman he'd broken had just remembered how to fight, and the man who'd claimed her had just given her every weapon she needed. The aristocracy thought this was a scandal. They had no idea it was a revolution. The morning after Seraphine crossed the threshold into Cassian's bedroom, London woke to rain that fell like accusations. She stood at the window of his chamber watching water streak down glass, aware of his presence behind her with every nerve ending in her body. "You're thinking too much," Cassian said from the bed, his voice rough with sleep and satisfaction. "I'm thinking exactly the right amount." She didn't turn. Last night changed everything. It changed nothing. We just stopped pretending we didn't want each other. "That's a lie, and you know it." Seraphine finally faced him, wrapping his silk robe tighter around herself. "I crossed a line. Society will have a field day with this." Society already had their field day when you left Edmund. This is just confirmation of what they wanted to believe anyway. Cassian rose, moving toward her with the casual confidence of a man who'd never doubted his right to take up space. "The only question that matters is whether you regret it." "No." The answer came without hesitation. "But I'm also not naive enough to think there won't be consequences. There are always consequences. The difference is whether we face them together or you face them alone." He reached her, his hand settling on her waist with possessive certainty. "I vote together." "You don't get a vote. This is my choice." "Wrong. You made your choice last night. Now we both live with it." Cassian's gaze was intense, unwavering. "And I promise you, anyone who tries to use this against you will learn very quickly why I've spent 15 years being the man people fear to cross. That's not comfort. That's a threat. It's a guarantee. There's a difference." She studied his face, reading the absolute conviction there. This was what separated Cassian from every other man she'd known. Edmund had promised protection and delivered control. Her father had promised security and delivered obligation. But Cassian promised nothing he couldn't deliver, and delivered exactly what he promised. "I need to understand something," she said. "This thing between us. Is it possession or partnership? Can it be both? Not if I'm going to survive it with any part of myself intact." Cassian was quiet for a long moment, and she watched him process the question with the same analytical precision he applied to business negotiations. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight she'd rarely heard. "I've spent my entire life taking what I want," he said, "building empires on the principle that power is the only currency that matters, that attachment is weakness, that caring is a liability. Then you walked into my world, and every principle I'd built my life on started crumbling. That's not an answer." "Yes, it is. You're just not hearing it." Cassian's hands tightened on her waist. "I want to possess you. Every part of you. Your body, your mind, your future. That's the truth. But I also want you to possess me right back. To demand as much as I take. To push back when I push too hard. That's partnership. And it's terrifying because I've never wanted both before." Seraphine felt something unlock in her chest. This was the vulnerability she'd been waiting for. The proof that beneath his armor of absolute certainty was a man who could admit uncertainty. "I can work with terrifying," she said. "I've been terrified for 5 years. At least with you, the fear feels like growth instead of survival. Good. Because what's coming next is going to require both of us at our strongest. What's coming? War. Edmund won't accept this quietly. Society won't let it slide. And there are people in Parliament and the courts who've been waiting years for an excuse to take me down. Cassian's smile was sharp as broken glass. We just handed them ammunition wrapped in scandal and tied with a bow made of broken marriage vows. So what do? We go on the offensive. We stop reacting and start controlling the narrative. We turn your story from scandal into sympathy, from weakness into strength. Cassian released her waist and moved to his wardrobe, pulling out clothes with the efficiency of a general preparing for battle. And we do it before Edmund realizes what he's sitting on. The folder. Exactly. You have this power to destroy him. The question is whether you're willing to use it. Seraphine thought about the thick folder she'd hidden in her rooms, the comprehensive documentation of Edmund's failures and crimes. Part of her wanted to bury it, to take the high road and let karma handle her former husband. But that part of her was the woman Edmund had created. Silent, accommodating, willing to endure rather than confront. The woman she was becoming had sharper teeth. Yes, she said, I'm willing. The strategy session happened over breakfast in Cassian's dining room, a space that felt more like a war room than a place for meals. He'd assembled his inner circle with the precision of a general calling his lieutenants. Marcus Thorne, his solicitor, was a predator in bespoke tailoring who'd built a career on finding loopholes in laws other men thought ironclad. Lady Victoria Hartford sat across from him, the only member of society who'd maintained public support for Seraphine, her connections making her invaluable for managing social fallout. And James Rutherford, Cassian's man of business, whose understanding of London's financial networks was encyclopedic and ruthless. Seraphine sat at Cassian's right hand, and the positioning wasn't lost on anyone. Let's be clear about what we're facing, Marcus said, spreading documents across the table. Edmund is broke, desperate, and vengeful. He's been making noise about contesting the marriage dissolution on grounds of coercion and undue influence. Can he prove it? Cassian's voice was flat, clinical. He doesn't need to prove it. He just needs to create enough doubt to drag this into the courts. And once it's in the courts, it becomes public spectacle. Marcus looked at Seraphine with something that might have been sympathy. Your reputation will be dissected in ways that make current gossip look gentle. So we make sure it never reaches the courts, Seraphine said. Every head turned toward her, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing. We make Edmund withdraw his objections voluntarily. With what leverage? Victoria asked. The man has nothing left to lose. Yes, he does. Seraphine reached for the folder she'd brought, sliding it across the table. He has his freedom. Marcus opened the folder, his eyes widening as he scanned the contents. My God, this is... Where did you get this? I've been collecting it for 3 years. Every mistress. Every illegal business deal, every bribe paid to avoid scrutiny, every time he came home drunk and said too much. Seraphine's voice was steady, cold. I wasn't planning to use it. I was just documenting my life in case I didn't survive it. But now we use it to make him go away, Cassian finished. His expression was proud, fierce. You've been playing the long game without even realizing it. Some of this is criminal, Marcus said, still reading. Embezzlement from parliamentary funds, insider trading, bribery of court officials. If this becomes public, Edmund doesn't just lose his reputation. He faces prosecution. Exactly. Seraphine met the solicitor's gaze. So we give him a choice. He withdraws all objections to the dissolution, signs a document swearing he'll never speak ill of me publicly, and agrees to a complete and permanent separation. In return, this folder stays private. And if he refuses, James asked, then we release it to the authorities and let justice take its course. Seraphine's smile was sharp. Either way, he stops being my problem. Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying Seraphine with new appreciation. You've changed. I've stopped apologizing for surviving. The room fell silent, the weight of what Seraphine had just proposed settling over them. This wasn't just strategy, it was revolution. A woman using the evidence of her own abuse and neglect to destroy the man who'd inflicted it. Cassian reached over, his hand covering hers on the table. Visible. Deliberate. A public claiming of alliance. Make it happen, he told Marcus. Draft the agreement. Set the meeting. And make sure Edmund understands that refusal isn't an option. Marcus nodded, already making notes. This is going to create waves. Good. Let them drown in it. The meeting with Edmund happened 3 days later in Marcus Thorne's office, a space designed to intimidate with its dark wood paneling and wall of law books that represented centuries of precedent being used as weapons. Edmund arrived looking like a man who'd aged a decade in a month. His suit was rumpled, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling with either rage or withdrawal. Seraphine sat across from him with Cassian beside her, and she felt her former husband's hatred like radiation. "You've got some nerve," Edmund spat, not even waiting for Marcus to begin the proceedings. "Bringing me here like a criminal to face my own wife and her lover." "Former wife," Cassian corrected, his voice arctic. "And I'm not her lover. I'm her future. You're her past. Learn the difference." Edmund's face reddened, but before he could respond, Marcus slid a folder across the table. The same folder Seraphine had compiled. The documentation of every failure, every crime, every moment of corruption. "What is this?" Edmund demanded. "This is your life," Marcus said calmly. 3 years of documented illegal activity, infidelity, and financial malfeasance. All verified. All ready to be turned over to the authorities. Edmund opened the folder and Seraphine watched the color drain from his face as he recognized what he was seeing. His hand started shaking harder. "I was there, Edmund." Seraphine's voice cut through his stammering. "For every meeting you thought I wasn't paying attention to. Every conversation you had while drunk. Every paper you left on your desk thinking I was too stupid or too cowed to understand what I was reading. I was there. And I was watching." "This is blackmail," Edmund hissed. "No. This is accountability." Seraphine leaned forward, and for the first time in their entire relationship, she was the one in control. "You spent 5 years making me feel powerless, making me believe I had no options, that I deserved what you did to me. Now you get to feel what that's like. You can't do this. The courts will never see these documents if you agree to our terms," Marcus interrupted. "Complete and permanent dissolution of marriage. No contest, no objections. You agree never to speak publicly about Lady Seraphine except in the most respectful terms. And you sign a binding agreement that if you violate any of these terms, this folder goes directly to the Crown Prosecutor. And if I refuse, then we release everything today." Edmund's political career ends. His business interests collapse. And he spends the next 5 to 10 years in prison explaining to a judge why he thought he was above the law. Cassian's voice held no heat, just absolute certainty. "Your choice, freedom or consequences." Edmund looked between them, his mind clearly racing through options that didn't exist. He was trapped, and everyone in the room knew it. "You've destroyed me," he said finally, his voice breaking. "Taken everything, my wife, my reputation, my future. I destroyed nothing." Seraphine's tone was clinical, precise. "You did this to yourself. I'm just making sure you can't do it to anyone else." The silence stretched, heavy with years of abuse and neglect crystallizing into this single moment of reckoning. "Fine," Edmund said, the word barely audible. "I'll sign." "Smart choice," Marcus said, already producing documents. "Though probably the first smart choice you've made in years." Edmund signed without reading, his hand shaking so badly the signature was barely legible. When it was done, he looked at Seraphine with something that might have been regret if it wasn't so thoroughly mixed with hatred. "I hope he destroys you the way you destroyed me," he said. "I'm not destroying you, Edmund. I'm just letting you destroy yourself." Seraphine stood, and there was finality in the gesture. "Goodbye. And for what it's worth, I hope you find a way to become a better man, though I won't be holding my breath." She walked out without looking back, and Cassian followed, leaving Edmund sitting in the wreckage of his own making. In the hallway, Seraphine's composure finally cracked. Her hand shook. Her breath came in short gasps. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was burning off, leaving raw emotion in its wake. Cassian pulled her into an empty conference room, his arms wrapping around her with protective certainty. "You did it," he said into her hair. "You stood up to him and won. I feel sick. That's normal. You just dismantled the man who spent 5 years trying to dismantle you. It's allowed to be complicated." She clung to him, letting herself shake, letting herself feel everything she'd suppressed to get through the meeting. Fear, anger, grief for the years lost, relief that it was finally over. What if he comes after me anyway? She whispered. Then I'll handle it. That's what I do. I handle problems so thoroughly they stop being problems. Cassian pulled back enough to look at her face. But I don't think he will. Edmund's many things, but he's not stupid. He knows what happens if he violates that agreement. Seraphine nodded, trying to believe it. The hard part's over, Cassian continued. Now comes the part where you build the life you actually want instead of the one that was forced on you. I don't even know what that looks like. Then we'll figure it out together. The social fallout was immediate and vicious. Within 48 hours of Edmund signing the agreement, rumors exploded across London like artillery fire. Lady Seraphine Alcott had blackmailed her husband into a divorce. Duke Viremont had orchestrated the whole thing to acquire another man's wife. The marriage had been built on lies from the beginning. Most of it was wrong. All of it was damaging. Seraphine attended her first public event since leaving Edmund 2 weeks later, a gallery opening that Victoria had insisted would be safe. She walked into the space on Cassian's arm, and the reaction was visceral. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The air filled with whispered judgment so thick it was almost visible. This was a mistake, Seraphine murmured. No, this is necessary. Cassian's hand tightened on her arm. They need to see you're not hiding, not ashamed, not broken. I feel all of those things. Then fake it until you don't. That's what power is. The ability to perform confidence until it becomes real. They moved through the gallery, and Seraphine felt every eye tracking their progress. Some looks were curious, some were hostile. A few were sympathetic, but those were drowned in the sea of judgment. Lady Alcott, a voice called out. Or should I say, former Lady Alcott. Seraphine turned to find Margaret Thornberry, one of Edmund's cousins, approaching with the predatory smile of someone who'd been waiting for this confrontation. Margaret, Seraphine said evenly, how lovely to see you. Is it? I would have thought you'd want to avoid family after what you did to poor Edmund. Poor Edmund. Seraphine felt anger flash hot in her chest. The same Edmund who spent our entire marriage gambling away money we didn't have and visiting brothels instead of coming home. That poor Edmund? Margaret's smile faltered. You have no proof of such slander. I have 3 years of documented proof. Would you like me to start listing specifics? Seraphine's voice remained calm, but steel ran beneath it. Because I'm happy to discuss your dear cousin's habits in detail. Right here. Right now. In front of everyone. The threat landed. Margaret's face paled. I didn't think so, Seraphine continued. Now if you'll excuse me, I have an exhibition to enjoy. She walked away, and behind her she heard Margaret's shocked silence. Cassian's hand on her back was warm, approving. Well done, he murmured. I'm shaking. I know, but they don't. That's what matters. They spent another hour at the gallery, enduring stares and whispers, but something had shifted. Seraphine had drawn a line she'd pushed back, and people had watched Margaret Thornberry retreat. By the time they left, the whispers had changed tone. Not approval, not yet, but something closer to wary respect. In the carriage ride home, Seraphine leaned against Cassian's shoulder, exhausted. How long does this last? She asked. The judgment, the whispers, the constant performance, until they get bored and find a new scandal, or until we give them something so compelling they have to accept it on our terms, such as marriage. Seraphine sat up, staring at him. What? Marry me. Cassian's expression was serious, intense. Not because society demands it, not because we need to legitimize anything, but because I want you in my life permanently, and I want everyone to know it's by choice on both our parts. That's insane. We've known each other 2 months. I've made billion-pound decisions in less time based on less certainty. Cassian turned to face her fully. I know what I want. I know who you are. I know we work together in ways I never thought possible. Time is irrelevant. This isn't a business deal, Cassian. This is my life. It's our life. And I'm asking you to build it with me. Not because you need rescue, not because I need a wife, but because we're better together than apart. Seraphine's mind raced. This was too fast. Too much. Too everything. But looking at Cassian's face, seeing the absolute certainty there, she felt something shift. Not yet, she said finally. Ask me again in 6 months. When the dust settles. When I've had time to become who I am, instead of reacting to who I was. Cassian smiled. I can work with that. Good. Because I'm not saying no. I'm saying not yet. That's all I need. The carriage pulled up to the townhouse, and they went inside together, but the conversation hung between them like a promise. 3 weeks later, Edmund made his second and final mistake. He showed up at a parliamentary session drunk, ranting about corruption and blackmail and wives who betrayed their vows. The spectacle was brief but devastating. Security removed him bodily while he screamed accusations that made no sense and revealed everything about his state of mind. Marcus sent word to Cassian within the hour. He's violated the agreement, the solicitor said when Cassian arrived at his office. Public disparagement. It's documented by 24 witnesses. Then we proceed as outlined. Cassian's voice was flat. Release the folder to the authorities. This will destroy him completely. No coming back. That was always the point. He had a choice. He made it. Now he faces consequences. Marcus nodded, already drafting the necessary communications. What about Lady Seraphine? Does she know? Tell her yourself, Cassian said. She deserves to hear it directly. Seraphine took the news with eerie calm. She sat in Cassian's study, the same room where he'd first given her the folder, and listened to Marcus explain what Edmund had done and what would happen next. When the solicitor finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I feel nothing, she said finally. No satisfaction, no guilt, just emptiness. That's normal, Marcus said gently. He was your husband for 5 years. Even bad relationships leave marks. He was never my husband. He was my jailer who happened to have a ring and a legal document. Seraphine looked at Cassian. When will the authorities move? Within 72 hours. Once they review the evidence, they'll issue warrants. And me? Will I be called to testify? Probably. Are you prepared for that? Seraphine thought about standing in a courtroom, recounting years of abuse and neglect for public consumption. Thought about Edmund's family trying to discredit her. Thought about society dissecting every moment of her marriage. Then she thought about the woman she'd been when she first met Cassian. Silent, invisible, convinced she deserved her treatment. Yes, she said. I'm prepared, young. The trial happened 4 months later, and it was everything Seraphine had feared and worse. Edmund's defense team painted her as a vindictive wife who'd invented abuse to justify adultery. They brought witnesses who testified to Edmund's generosity and kindness. They suggested she'd been having an affair with Cassian long before leaving her husband. Seraphine sat through it all with quiet dignity, and when it was her turn to testify, she spoke with a clarity that silenced the courtroom. She detailed the abuse, the financial control, the isolation, the bruises hidden under powder and long sleeves. She produced letters from physicians who'd treated her injuries. She submitted the journal she'd kept, documenting every incident with dates and details. And when Edmund's lawyer tried to break her on cross-examination, asking why she didn't leave sooner, why she stayed if it was so terrible, she gave an answer that would be quoted in newspapers for weeks. I stayed because I'd been taught that marriage was forever, that a good wife endured, that my value was tied to my ability to maintain appearances. She looked directly at Edmund as she spoke. I stayed because leaving felt like failure, and I'd spent my entire life being told that women who failed their marriages deserved whatever happened to them. I stayed because I was afraid, and then I met someone who taught me that fear is only powerful when you're facing it alone. The courtroom was silent. Edmund was convicted on 7 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and corruption. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, his title stripped, his assets seized to repay his debts. Seraphine watched the verdict being read with the same strange emptiness she'd felt when she'd first learned about the charges. This should have felt like victory, like justice. Instead, it just felt like the end of something that should have ended years ago. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, questions were shouted from all directions. Lady Seraphine, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you regret your role in your husband's downfall? What's next for you and the Duke? Cassian's security moved them through the crowd, but Seraphine stopped at the courthouse steps. Cassian looked at her questioningly, and she nodded. She turned to face the cameras. I feel relieved, she said clearly. Relieved that the truth came out. Relieved that justice was served. And relieved that I'll never again have to pretend that abuse is acceptable because it happens behind closed doors. The questions intensified, but Cassian's hand found the small of her back, and together they walked to the waiting carriage. Inside, with the door closed and the noise muted, Seraphine finally let herself break. Not with tears, with laughter. Hysterical, cathartic laughter that came from somewhere deep and raw. It's over, she gasped between laughs. It's actually over. Yes, Cassian said, pulling her close. It's over. What now? Now you decide who you want to be when you're not defined by surviving someone else's cruelty. I want to be free, truly free, not just legally, but emotionally. Seraphine pulled back to look at him. And I want to be with you, not because I need rescue, not because I need protection, but because I choose it. Cassian's expression softened in that way it only did for her. Is this your way of accepting my proposal? This is my way of saying, ask me again. Marry me, Seraphine. Build a life with me that's ours by choice, not by obligation. Yes, the word was simple, but it carried the weight of revolution. A woman who'd spent 5 years having her choices stripped away, making the biggest choice of her life freely. They kissed in the carriage while London rolled past outside, and for the first time in her life, Seraphine felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The wedding happened 6 months later, small and private, with only the people who mattered in attendance. Victoria stood as Seraphine's witness, crying through the entire ceremony. Marcus handled the legal details with his usual precision. James ensured the reception ran smoothly. And Cassian stood at the altar, watching Seraphine walk toward him with an expression that was pure possession and pure reverence in equal measure. She wore cream silk instead of white. A deliberate choice. This wasn't about purity or virginity or any of society's poisonous expectations. This was about two people who'd found each other in the wreckage and decided to build something new. When the officiant asked if she took Cassian as her husband, Seraphine didn't hesitate. I do. And when Cassian was asked the same, his answer was equally certain. I do. They sealed it with a kiss that was claiming and being claimed, power meeting power. Two people who'd learned that partnership meant choosing strength together instead of wielding it alone. The reception was small, intimate, nothing like the elaborate affairs London society demanded. They danced, they laughed. They existed in a bubble of chosen happiness while the world outside continued its eternal judgment. Later, in their bedroom, with moonlight streaming through windows and the sounds of London muted by distance, Cassian pulled Seraphine close. No regrets? He asked. None. You? Only that I didn't find you sooner. If you'd found me sooner, I wouldn't have been ready. I had to break first. Had to learn what I was worth when stripped of everything I thought defined me. You were always worth everything. You just needed someone to see it. No. Seraphine turned to face him fully. I needed to see it myself. You just held up the mirror. They made love that night with a tenderness that was new, a claiming that came from choice rather than need. And afterward, tangled together in silk sheets, Seraphine felt something she'd never experienced before. Peace. Not happiness, though that was there too, but genuine bone-deep peace. The knowledge that she was exactly where she chose to be, with exactly who she chose to be with, building exactly the life she wanted. Tell me something, she said into the darkness. That first night at the Hartwell ball, when you saw me, what did you actually see? Cassian was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. I saw a woman who'd learned to make herself invisible to survive, who'd buried everything real and vital about herself so deep she'd almost forgotten it existed. I saw intelligence hidden behind practiced smiles, strength disguised as compliance, fire banked so low it was almost extinguished. He pulled her closer. And I saw what would happen if someone gave you permission to burn again. And now I see exactly who you were meant to be all along. Powerful, brilliant, unafraid to take up space, willing to fight for what matters. You made me this way. No, I just removed the obstacles that were keeping you from becoming it yourself. There's a difference. Seraphine smiled in the darkness. Cassian Viermont, the most dangerous man in London. Secretly a romantic. Not romantic. Practical. I wanted you. I took you. I kept you. That's not romance. That's strategy. You proposed with poetry about building lives together by choice. Strategic poetry. She laughed, and the sound was free, unguarded. I love you. The words hung in the air. She'd never said them before. Not to Edmund. Not to anyone. They'd always felt like weapons that could be used against her, but saying them to Cassian felt like armor instead. I know, he said. Then, softer. I love you too. though I'm not entirely sure what that means beyond wanting you happy, safe, and beside me until we're both dead. That's a pretty good definition. Is it? It's enough. They fell asleep tangled together, and outside their window, London glittered and judged and continued its eternal machinations. But inside, two people who'd found power in partnership slept the sleep of the righteous and the ruthless in equal measure. 6 months after the wedding, Seraphine stood in the study that had once been exclusively Cassian's domain, reviewing contracts for her new venture. A publishing house, specifically focused on women's writing, stories that challenged, perspectives that disrupted, voices that had been silenced. It was ambitious, potentially scandalous, likely to fail by conventional wisdom. Cassian loved it. "You're going to make enemies," he said, reading over her shoulder. "Good. I've gotten very good at handling enemies." "Yes, you have." He kissed the top of her head. "When do you plan to announce?" "Next week, at the literary salon Victoria's hosting. The same salon where half of London's elite will be watching?" "Exactly. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it publicly. No hiding, no apologies. That's my girl." Seraphine smiled at the possessive pride in his voice. She'd learned to accept his need to claim her, to mark her as his, because she did the same right back. They wore each other's possession like badges of honor, proof that they'd chosen each other freely and fiercely. "There's something else," she said, turning to face him. "I've been thinking about the townhouse, the one you gave me when I first left Edmund. What about it? I want to turn it into a sanctuary for women leaving abusive marriages, a place they can stay while they figure out next steps, with legal support, financial counseling, whatever they need to build new lives." Cassian studied her face, and she saw the moment understanding clicked. "You want to give them what you had, the resources to escape." "Yes. Not every woman has a duke willing to burn down the world for her, but they shouldn't need one. They should have options that don't depend on finding the right protector." "How much will it cost?" Seraphine named a figure that would have made her former self faint. Cassian didn't even blink. "Done. I'll have Marcus handle the legal structure. You'll run it?" "With Victoria's help." "She's already agreed." "Of course she has." Cassian pulled Seraphine close, his arms wrapping around her with familiar possession. "You're going to change the world." "I'm going to try. One woman at a time. That's how revolutions start. One choice, one person, one refusal to accept that things have to stay as they've always been. Is that what we are? A revolution? We're the proof that power doesn't have to corrupt, that strength can be used to protect instead of control, that two broken people can find each other and build something neither could have created alone." Cassian's voice was quiet, serious. "If that's not revolutionary, I don't know what is." Seraphine kissed him, pouring into it everything she couldn't articulate. Gratitude, love, the bone-deep knowledge that this, what they'd built together, was worth every moment of pain that had led to it. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for giving me the tools to fight back, for loving me enough to let me become who I needed to be instead of keeping me as who you first wanted. You did all the hard work. I just provided the opportunity. You provided everything." "No." Cassian pulled back to look at her directly. "You provided everything. The courage, the strength, the willingness to face down everything you'd been taught to accept and say no more. I just made sure you were protected while you did it. Then we're even. We'll never be even. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you. Good. I'll spend the rest of mine making sure you have to keep trying." They stood together in the study, surrounded by the evidence of the empire they were building. Not just financial, though Cassian's wealth continued to grow, but social, moral, a framework for what partnership could look like when stripped of society's poisonous expectations. Outside, London continued its eternal dance. Inside, two people who'd found each other in the wreckage prepared for whatever came next. Because there would be challenges, there would be judgment, there would be people who never forgave Seraphine for choosing herself over obligation, or Cassian for breaking unspoken rules about staying in his lane. But they'd face it together, and that made all the difference. Well, the announcement of Seraphine's sanctuary came at Victoria's literary salon, and the reaction was exactly as divisive as predicted. Half the room applauded. The other half whispered scandal. Seraphine stood at the front of Victoria's drawing room, Cassian beside her, and spoke with a clarity that came from hard-won certainty. Marriage should be a choice freely made and freely continued, she said. But for too many women, it becomes a trap. Financial dependence, social pressure, fear of judgment or destitution. These things keep women in situations that are killing them, and society pretends it's their duty to endure. The room was silent, every eye locked on her. I'm not pretending anymore. The sanctuary will provide women with resources to leave abusive marriages safely. Legal counsel, financial support, a place to stay while they rebuild. Not charity, empowerment. Because no woman should have to find a duke willing to wage war for her freedom. She should have it by right. The applause when she finished was deafening from half the room. The other half sat in stony silence. Margaret Thornberry, Edmund's cousin, stood abruptly. You're encouraging women to abandon their vows, she said loudly, to destroy families, I'm encouraging women to survive, Seraphine cut her off. And if their survival requires leaving marriages built on abuse, then yes, I'm encouraging that. Enthusiastically. This is an abomination. Then don't use it. Seraphine's voice was calm, steel underneath. But don't you dare judge women who do. You have no idea what they've endured, what they've survived, what it costs them to ask for help. Margaret's face reddened, but before she could respond, Victoria stood. I'll be serving on the sanctuary's board, she announced, and I'll be donating significantly to its founding. Anyone else who'd like to contribute, see me after. 3 other women stood, then 5, then 10. Margaret fled, and half the room went with her. But the half that stayed represented more actual power than the half that left. Money. Influence. The kind of support that would make the sanctuary not just possible, but successful. Afterward, as people mingled and discussed details, Cassian pulled Seraphine aside. You just declared war on half of London's elite, he said. I know. Any regrets? None. You? I've never been prouder of anything in my life. They kissed in full view of everyone remaining, a public claiming that was also a public promise. This was who they were. Partners in revolution. Allies in dismantling systems built to keep people powerless. And they were just getting started. Quote. That night, in the privacy of their bedroom, with the sounds of success still ringing in their ears, Seraphine stood at the window looking out at London. Cassian joined her, his arms wrapping around her from behind. What are you thinking? He asked. I'm thinking about the woman I was 2 years ago. Standing in Edmund's house, convinced I deserved what he did to me, believing I had no options, no power, no future beyond enduring until I died or he killed me. And now I'm standing in my own home, married to a man I chose freely, about to launch a venture that will help women find the freedom I found. Seraphine turned in his arms. It's almost too much, like it can't be real. It's real. And you earned every bit of it. We earned it. This doesn't exist without you. Wrong. This exists because of you. I provided resources. You provided the courage to use them. Cassian's voice was firm. Don't diminish what you've accomplished by giving me credit for your strength. Seraphine studied his face, seeing the absolute conviction there. This was what made their partnership work. He demanded she own her power just as fiercely as he owned his. All right, she said. I did this. I chose freedom. I chose you. I chose to build something that matters. Yes. And tomorrow you'll wake up and choose it again, and the day after that, until choosing becomes who you are instead of what you do. Is that what power is? The ability to keep choosing? That's exactly what it is. Everything else is just window dressing. They stood together at the window, watching London sleep below them, and Seraphine felt the weight of possibilities settle over her like a mantle. There would be obstacles. There would be people who tried to tear down what she built. There would be moments of doubt and fear, but she'd face them all with the same certainty that had brought her here. The certainty that she deserved better than survival. The certainty that power was meant to be shared, not hoarded. The certainty that choosing yourself wasn't selfish when the alternative was self-destruction. And most importantly, the certainty that she was done apologizing for taking up space in a world that had spent centuries trying to convince women they should disappear. Tell me something, she said into the quiet. Do you ever regret it? Breaking your own rules about attachment, choosing partnership over power. Every day, Cassian said. And when she stiffened, he continued, I regret that I didn't find you sooner, that you had to endure 5 years with Edmund before I could offer you a way out, that society's poisonous rules kept us from each other longer than necessary. He turned her to face him fully. But I don't regret a single moment since you walked into my life. Not the scandal, not the judgment, not the complete restructuring of everything I thought I knew about strength and control, because you taught me that power without purpose is just cruelty. And my purpose is making sure you never have to dim your light to make anyone else comfortable. Seraphine felt tears prick her eyes, but this time she didn't fight them. I love you, she said. Not because you saved me, but because you saw me. Really saw me. When I couldn't see myself. I love you because you saved yourself. I just made sure you were safe while you did it. They kissed in the moonlight, and it was claiming and being claimed, power meeting power. Two people who'd learned that partnership meant facing the world together instead of conquering it alone. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Seraphine smiled. So what's next for the most scandalous couple in London? We keep building, keep choosing each other. Keep proving that power is strongest when it's shared freely. Cassian's smile was predatory and proud. And we make damn sure that any woman who needs an escape route has one. No matter how much it costs? No matter how much it costs. Financial, social, or otherwise. We've got the resources, we've got the platform, we've got the absolute certainty that we're right and they're wrong. That's a dangerous combination. That's the only combination that's ever changed anything. They went to bed that night tangled together, and as Seraphine drifted off to sleep, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, from ghost to woman, from possession to person, from victim to victor. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been clean. There had been moments of doubt and fear and absolute terror that she was making the wrong choice. But standing on the other side of it all, with Cassian beside her and a future built on choice rather than obligation, stretching ahead, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would do it all again. Every painful moment, every terrifying choice, every public humiliation, because they'd led her here. To freedom, to power, to partnership, to herself. And that was worth any price. The empire Cassian and Seraphine built over 18 months stood as testament to what power looked like when wielded with purpose instead of cruelty. The sanctuary had saved 23 women from marriages that were killing them. Seraphine's publishing house had released 4 books that challenged everything polite society held sacred. And their marriage had become the standard against which London measured partnerships, even as half the city still whispered scandal. Cassian stood in his study reviewing quarterly reports that showed growth across every venture when Marcus Thorne arrived unannounced. The solicitor's face carried an expression Cassian had never seen before. Not worry, not concern, something closer to dread. We need to talk, Marcus said, closing the door behind him. Privately, Cassian set down his papers. That tone suggested this wasn't about contracts or legal minutiae. What happened? Marcus pulled out a folder, and the sight of it made something cold settle in Cassian's chest. I've been conducting routine financial audits across your holdings. Standard procedure. Except I found something that isn't standard at all. Show me. The documents Marcus spread across the desk were complex financial instruments. Shell companies layered within shell companies, transactions routed through accounts Cassian didn't recognize. But what made his blood run cold was the signature on half of them. Seraphine's. This can't be right, Cassian said, his voice flat. These accounts don't exist. These companies aren't mine. They're not yours. They're hers. Marcus pointed to a series of transfers. She's been systematically moving money out of your holdings for the past 8 months. Small amounts at first, larger ones recently. Sophisticated enough that it took me 3 weeks to trace the full pattern. Cassian stared at the documents, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. There had to be an explanation, a mistake, something that made sense. How much? He asked. So far? Nearly £2 million. And that's just what I've found. There could be more buried deeper. The number landed like a physical blow. Not because Cassian couldn't afford to lose £2 million. His wealth was vast enough that the loss wouldn't cripple him. But because of what it represented. Betrayal. From the one person he'd trusted absolutely. Where's it going? Cassian's voice was carefully controlled, but underneath ran something dangerous. That's where it gets complicated. Marcus pulled out another set of documents. The money's being funneled through 3 different offshore accounts, then redistributed to what appear to be private investments, property purchases, business ventures, all under shell companies with untraceable ownership structures. So she's building her own empire with my money. It looks that way, though I haven't been able to determine the end game yet. Cassian stood, moving to the window that overlooked London. His London, the city he'd conquered through intelligence and ruthlessness. The same city now witnessing his wife systematically dismantling what he'd built. The philosophical question that haunted men of power throughout history echoed in his mind. Was loyalty ever real, or just a performance maintained until better opportunities emerged? He'd spent his life believing that strength was the only reliable constant, that attachment was weakness waiting to be exploited. Then Seraphine had made him question everything, made him believe partnership could exist without betrayal. And now this. Does she know you found it? He asked. Not unless she's monitoring my activities as closely as I'm monitoring hers. Then don't let her know. Continue the audit. Find everything. I want complete documentation before I confront her. Cassian, Marcus's voice held warning. If you're wrong about this, if there's an explanation, then she'll provide it when I ask. But if I'm right, I need to know the full extent of the damage before I decide what to do about it. Marcus gathered his documents with visible reluctance. I'll have a complete report within 72 hours. After the solicitor left, Cassian stood alone in his study, staring at the city below. Every instinct screamed that there was a mistake, a misunderstanding, something that would make this make sense. But the evidence didn't lie, and neither did the cold certainty settling in his chest. Seraphine had betrayed him. The only question was why. Cassian spent the next 3 days watching his wife with the analytical precision he applied to hostile takeovers, looking for signs, cracks in her facade, anything that suggested guilt or deception. He found nothing. Seraphine moved through their life with the same warmth and authenticity she'd shown since the day she'd chosen to stay with him. She worked on her publishing ventures. She managed the sanctuary with passionate efficiency. She came to his bed each night with desire that seemed entirely genuine. Either she was the most accomplished liar he'd ever encountered, or there was something else happening. Marcus delivered his final report on the 3rd evening. Cassian read it alone in his study, and with each page, the betrayal became more comprehensive. £2.7 million moved over 8 months. Not just stolen. Strategically relocated to build a parallel financial structure that mirrored his own. Property in 3 countries. Investments in shipping, textiles, and publishing. A network designed to function independently of his resources. She was preparing to leave him, building an escape route with his own money. The realization felt like drowning in ice water. At the bottom of Marcus's report was a final note. I found communication records between Lady Seraphine and Edmund Alcott's former solicitor, multiple meetings over the past 6 months. No documentation of what was discussed, but the timing correlates with the largest financial transfers. Edmund's solicitor, the man who'd represented her abusive husband throughout their divorce proceedings, the man who'd fought hardest against Seraphine's settlement, now meeting secretly with the woman who'd destroyed his client. Cassian felt something crack inside him, not his heart. He'd armored that too thoroughly for such poetic damage, but his certainty. His belief that he'd finally found someone who wouldn't betray him when the stakes got high enough. That night, when Seraphine came to bed, Cassian pretended sleep. He felt her settle beside him, her breathing evening out into rest, and he lay there in the darkness wondering how long she'd been planning this. 8 months of lies. 8 months of stolen moments and secret meetings and money quietly disappearing into offshore accounts. 8 months of making him believe she loved him while systematically preparing to destroy everything he'd built. The question that consumed him wasn't how she'd done it. The mechanics were clear enough. The question was why. What had he done to make her fear him enough to build this elaborate escape? What had he missed that would drive the woman he'd married, the woman he'd given everything to protect and empower, to betray him so completely? By morning, Cassian had his answer. Nothing. He'd done nothing wrong. This wasn't about his failures, this was about her nature. Once a victim, always a victim. Once someone learned to survive through deception and manipulation, they never truly unlearned it. They just got better at hiding it. Seraphine had been playing him from the beginning, the grateful wife, the empowered woman, the loving partner. All performance, all designed to keep him complacent while she built her exit strategy. The realization should have made him angry. Instead, it made him cold. Cold was better. Cold was what had built his empire in the first place. Cold was what would let him dismantle her betrayal with the same surgical precision she'd used to construct it. Cassian called the confrontation for Friday evening. He arranged it carefully, sent the staff away, ensured privacy, set the study like a stage for the reckoning that was coming. Seraphine arrived at the appointed time, her expression curious but unconcerned. She wore a green dress he'd bought her, and the sight of it made something twist in his chest. Even now, even knowing what he knew, part of him wanted to be wrong. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. The same chair she'd sat in 18 months ago when he'd first offered her freedom. "Yes." Cassian slid the folder across the desk. "I need you to explain this." She opened it, and he watched her face carefully for the moment of recognition, the flash of guilt. Instead, he saw confusion. She flipped through pages, her brow furrowing. "These are financial documents. What am I looking at? You tell me." "Those are accounts in your name. Transfers you authorized. Money you've been systematically stealing from my holdings for 8 months. Seraphine's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "What? Cassian, I don't understand. I haven't. Don't." His voice cut like a blade. "Don't lie to me. I have documentation, signatures, transfer authorizations, meeting records with Edmund's solicitor. Everything." Her face went pale. "Edmund's solicitor? I haven't met with—" "You met with him 6 times over the past 6 months. The timing correlates perfectly with the largest financial transfers. So please, enlighten me. What could you possibly have been discussing with the man who tried to destroy you during your divorce?" "I don't know what you're talking about." Seraphine stood, the folder falling from her lap. "Cassian, this is insane. I would never— 2.7 million pounds says otherwise." The number hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Seraphine stared at him, and he watched something shift in her expression. Confusion giving way to comprehension, then horror. "Someone's setting me up," she said. "How convenient." "No, listen to me. Someone is using my identity to move money and arrange meetings. This isn't me." Then explain the signatures. Explain the authorizations that could only have come from someone with intimate access to my financial systems. Cassian stood, his hands flat on the desk. Explain how a woman I've given everything to would repay me by stealing millions and planning an exit strategy with the help of her former husband's legal team. "I can't explain it because I didn't do it." Seraphine's voice rose, desperation creeping in. "You have to believe me. Someone is framing—" "Stop. Just stop." Cassian's control was fracturing, rage bleeding through the cracks. "I trusted you. I gave you access to everything. My money, my name, my protection. I broke every rule I'd built my life on because I thought you were different, that we were building something real. We are. This isn't real. This is exactly what I should have expected." His laugh was bitter. "You spent 5 years learning to survive by manipulating Edmund. Why would you be any different with me? You just got smarter about it." Tears streamed down Seraphine's face now, but Cassian couldn't let himself care. Tears were just another tool in the arsenal of deception. "I love you," she said. "Everything we built together is real. I don't know who's doing this, but it isn't me. You have to believe me. I don't have to do anything except protect what's mine, and you've just proven you're not part of that anymore." The words landed like blows, and Cassian saw her physically recoil. Good. Let her feel a fraction of what he was feeling. "Get out," he said quietly. "What?" "Get out of my study, out of my house, out of my life. We're done." "Cassian, please. I'll have Marcus draw up divorce papers. You'll get nothing. The prenuptial agreement you signed was very clear about what happens in cases of fraud and theft. You'll leave with exactly what you brought into this marriage. Nothing." Seraphine stood frozen, her face devastated. "You can't mean this." "Try me." Cassian's voice was arctic. "You have until morning to pack your belongings and leave. After that, I'll have you removed by force. And if you try to fight this, I will destroy you more completely than I destroyed Edmund. At least he had the decency to betray me with incompetence instead of calculation. I didn't betray you." Her voice broke. "Someone is doing this to us, to drive us apart. and you're letting them win. The only person driving us apart is you, with your lies, your theft, your systematic dismantling of everything I gave you. Cassian moved to the door, opening it. Now get the fuck out. She didn't move, just stood there crying, looking at him like he was the monster. Maybe he was. Maybe that's all he'd ever been, and she'd just been better at hiding her fear than Edmund's other victims. Fine. Stay. I'll leave. Cassian grabbed his coat. But when I come back, you better be gone, or I'll call the authorities and have you arrested for embezzlement. He left her standing in the study, and this time he didn't look back. Sulk. Cassian spent the night at his club, drinking expensive scotch and trying to understand how he'd gotten it so wrong. The woman he'd married had seemed genuine. The love they'd built had felt real. The partnership they'd forged had appeared to transform them both. But evidence didn't lie. Numbers didn't manipulate. The documentation Marcus had compiled was irrefutable. Seraphine had betrayed him. Unless, the thought came at 3 a.m, fuzzy with alcohol and exhaustion. Unless she was telling the truth. Unless someone really was framing her. But who? And why? Edmund was in prison. His family had scattered after the trial. There were no enemies obvious enough to orchestrate something this elaborate. Except, Cassian sat up sharply, his mind suddenly clear despite the scotch. There was one person who had the access, the intelligence, and the motive. Marcus Thorne, his solicitor, his trusted advisor for 15 years, the man who handled all his financial affairs, the man who would know exactly how to move money without detection, the man who could forge signatures because he had access to original documents, the man who'd been acting strangely for months before bringing these allegations forward. Cassian's blood ran cold. If Marcus was behind this, if he'd been systematically stealing and framing Seraphine, then Cassian had just destroyed his marriage based on lies, had accused the one person who'd never betrayed him of the one crime she'd never commit. He grabbed his coat and ran. Cassian burst through the door of his townhouse at dawn to find Seraphine still in the study. She hadn't moved, hadn't packed, just sat in the chair where he'd left her, staring at nothing. "Don't," she said when she saw him. "Don't apologize if you're just going to accuse me again. I need to know something, and I need you to tell me the absolute truth. I've only ever told you the truth. Marcus Thorne, has he ever approached you privately? Asked you to sign documents? Had you authorized anything financial?" Seraphine's brow furrowed. "He had me sign papers 3 months ago. Said they were routine updates to the trust structures. Why? What kind of papers?" "I don't know. Legal documents. He said it was just administrative, that you'd already approved everything." She stood slowly. "Cassian, what's happening? I think Marcus has been stealing from me. Using your identity to do it. Setting you up to take the fall if anyone discovered it." The words hung in the air, and Cassian watched understanding dawn across Seraphine's face. "He's been your solicitor for 15 years. Why would he?" "Because I'm rich enough that even a fraction of what he's stolen would set him up for life. And because framing you provides the perfect scapegoat." Cassian moved to his desk, pulling out the files Marcus had given him. "Look at these again. Really look." Seraphine studied the documents with the analytical mind that had made her publishing house successful. After several minutes, she pointed to a signature. "This isn't my writing," she said. "It's close. Very close. But the loop on the S is wrong, and the way the final E connects is too sharp. I've signed thousands of documents. I know my own signature." Cassian looked where she pointed, and she was right. The differences were minute, but they were there. Forgery's good enough to pass casual inspection, but not forensic analysis. "He played us both," Cassian said quietly. "Made me believe you were stealing. Made you sign documents you thought were routine. Probably has enough money offshore by now to disappear. So what do we do?" Seraphine's question hung in the air, and Cassian felt the full weight of what he had almost destroyed crash over him. He'd accused her, called her a liar, told her to leave, nearly ended their marriage over evidence manufactured by a man he'd trusted for 15 years. The philosophical reality of power settled over him like a shroud. Strength meant nothing if you couldn't recognize when you were being manipulated. Authority was worthless if you wielded it against the wrong target. He'd spent his life believing he was too intelligent to be fooled, too careful to be betrayed by anyone but the obvious suspects. But Marcus had known exactly which pressure points to push, had understood that Cassian's deepest fear was betrayal from Seraphine. had crafted a scenario so believable that Cassian had abandoned every instinct that told him she was genuine, and in doing so had nearly destroyed the only real thing he'd ever built. "I'm sorry," he said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. "I should have trusted you, should have questioned the evidence instead of accepting it. You trusted the man you'd worked with for 15 years over the woman you'd known for 2. Seraphine's voice was quiet, exhausted. "I understand the logic, even if it breaks my heart. I'll fix this. I'll find Marcus, get the money back, make him pay for what he tried to do. And us? What about us?" Cassian looked at his wife, seeing the damage he'd inflicted in a single night of accusations, the trust he'd broken, the safety he'd demolished. She'd spent 5 years with a man who'd made her feel worthless, and Cassian had just proven he could do the same when he was scared enough. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know if you can forgive this, if we can come back from it." "Neither do I." Seraphine wrapped her arms around herself. "But I know I can't do it right now. I need time, space, to figure out if I can trust you again after you threw away everything we built over fabricated evidence." The words gutted him, but he couldn't argue. She was right. "Take whatever time you need. I'll find Marcus, fix the financial damage. And when you're ready, if you're ready, we'll figure out what comes next." Seraphine nodded, then walked past him toward the door. She paused in the threshold. "I hope you find him," she said. "Not for the money, but because he needs to answer for trying to destroy us." Then she was gone, and Cassian stood alone in the study where his empire had crumbled. Finding Marcus Thorne proved harder than anticipated. The solicitor had vanished completely, his office cleared, his apartment abandoned, his personal accounts closed. 3 weeks of investigation yielded only dead ends and offshore transfers that disappeared into financial labyrinths too complex to untangle quickly. James Rutherford, Cassian's man of business, reported his findings with grim efficiency. "He's gone, probably using a false identity by now. The money's scattered across 14 different accounts in 7 countries, all with banking secrecy laws that make recovery nearly impossible. Nearly impossible isn't impossible. It might as well be." James spread documents across Cassian's desk. "Even if we could prove theft, which gets complicated when he had legitimate access to your accounts, the legal process would take years. And that's assuming we could even locate him to serve papers." Cassian stared at the documents, feeling the walls close in. Marcus had planned this perfectly. Stolen millions framed Seraphine and disappeared before anyone could stop him. It was brilliant in its cruelty. "What about the signature forgeries? Can we use those?" "Possibly. If we can get a handwriting expert to testify. But again, that requires finding Marcus and getting him into a courtroom." James hesitated. "There is one other option." "What?" "Let it go. Write off the loss. Move on. You're still wealthy enough that this doesn't cripple you. It's not about the money. It's about justice." Cassian's voice was flat. "He tried to destroy my marriage, frame my wife. That doesn't get forgiven. Then you're looking at years of legal battles with no guarantee of success. Is that really how you want to spend your future?" The question hung in the air, and Cassian had no good answer. Because the truth was, he'd already lost what mattered most. The money was replaceable. Marcus's freedom was frustrating but not devastating. What he couldn't replace was Seraphine's trust. 3 weeks without her felt like drowning. The townhouse was empty despite being full of staff. His bed was cold despite expensive linens. Every success felt hollow without her there to share it. He'd finally found something that mattered more than power or wealth or reputation, and he'd thrown it away over forged documents and manufactured evidence. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his life being the man who didn't get fooled, who saw through deception, who controlled every variable. And the moment someone who actually mattered was threatened, he'd failed spectacularly. "Where is she staying?" he asked James. "With Lady Hartford. Victoria's been very clear that you're not welcome." "Has she said anything? About what she wants?" "Just that she needs time." James's expression softened. "For what it's worth, I think she still loves you. But love isn't always enough to overcome broken trust." The words hit harder than any financial loss could. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Victoria Hartford showed up at Cassian's townhouse unannounced, her expression combining anger and reluctant sympathy in equal measure. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past his butler. "Privately." Cassian led her to his study, the same room where everything had fallen apart. How is she? Devastated, angry, heartbroken. Victoria sat without being invited. She's been staying with me for 3 weeks, and I've watched her cry herself to sleep every night. So congratulations, Viermont. You've accomplished what Edmund never could. You've actually broken her. The accusation landed like a physical blow. I was wrong. I know that. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you took the first piece of evidence that confirmed your worst fears and used it to destroy the woman who loved you. No questions, no benefit of doubt, just immediate condemnation. Marcus was convincing. Marcus was a thief who knew exactly how to manipulate you. Victoria leaned forward. But here's what I don't understand. You've built an empire on reading people, on seeing through deception, on trusting your instincts. Why didn't you trust them with Seraphine? The question cut to the bone because Cassian had been asking himself the same thing every night for 3 weeks. Because I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid that she'd realize she didn't need me anymore. That the woman I'd helped empower would outgrow me. That love was just another transaction waiting to end when better terms emerged. So you sabotaged it yourself, made it end on your terms before she could leave on hers. Yes, Victoria studied him with sharp eyes. That's the most honest you've been since this started. Now here's what you're going to do. You're going to stop trying to find Marcus. You're going to accept the financial loss. And you're going to focus entirely on proving to Seraphine that you trust her absolutely, regardless of what evidence appears or what fears surface. I don't know if she'll let me. She won't. Not yet. Victoria stood. But eventually, she might. If you're patient, if you're genuine, if you show her that you've learned the difference between power and partnership, between control and trust. What if it's too late? Then you'll have lost the only thing that actually mattered. And you'll spend the rest of your life understanding exactly what that cost you. After Victoria left, Cassian sat alone with the weight of her words. She was right. The money didn't matter. Finding Marcus didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was whether Seraphine could forgive him for choosing fear over faith, and he had no idea if that was even possible. The answer came 6 weeks after the confrontation. Seraphine appeared at the townhouse without warning, and Cassian's heart stuttered at the sight of her. She looked different, thinner, tired, but there was steel in her spine that hadn't been there before. "We need to talk," she said. Cassian led her to the drawing room this time, not the study. Too many ghosts in that space. They sat in careful silence, and Cassian waited for her to begin. This was her conversation, her terms. "I've been thinking a lot about trust," she finally said. "About what it means, what it costs when it breaks, whether it can be rebuilt." "Seraphine, let me finish." Her voice was firm. "I spent 5 years with Edmund learning that I couldn't trust my own judgment, that my instincts were wrong, that I deserved whatever happened to me. You helped me unlearn that, helped me remember that I was worth more than survival." "I know. And then you proved that you'd learned nothing, that the moment you were tested, you'd choose fear over faith, evidence over instinct, control over partnership." Seraphine's eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. "You became exactly what I'd escaped from. A man who claimed to love me but really just wanted to possess me." The words landed like blows, each one deserved. "I'm sorry," Cassian said. "It's inadequate, but it's true. I was wrong. I should have trusted you." "Yes, you should have. But sorry doesn't undo the damage, doesn't erase the fact that you threw away everything we built over fabricated evidence, doesn't change that you were willing to believe the worst of me with almost no resistance. So where does that leave us?" Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. Because I still love you, even after everything. Even knowing that you could hurt me like that. I still love you." Cassian felt hope flare, dangerous and desperate. "But love isn't enough," she continued. "Not when trust is gone. Not when I know that the moment you get scared again, you might destroy us over evidence that confirms your fears instead of challenging them. Then tell me how to fix it. Tell me what I need to do to earn back what I destroyed." "I don't think you can." Seraphine's voice broke slightly. "I think we're done, Cassian. Not because I don't love you, but because I can't live my life waiting for the next time you choose fear over us." The words hit like a death sentence. "Please," Cassian said, and he hated the desperation in his voice. "Don't give up on us. I'll do whatever it takes. Spend years proving I trust you absolutely. Walk away from everything if that's what you need. Just don't end this. Walking away from everything is easy. It's dramatic and clean and lets you feel like you've sacrificed something. Seraphine stood. But that's not what I need. I need you to stay exactly where you are and learn to trust me even when it's hard. Even when evidence suggests otherwise. Even when your worst fears are screaming at you. I can do that. Can you? Because 3 weeks ago you couldn't. What's changed? Everything. I've spent 6 weeks understanding exactly what I lost, what I destroyed. I'll never make that mistake again. You can't promise that. No one can. Seraphine moved toward the door. Fear doesn't just disappear because you've learned a lesson. It comes back. And when it does, you'll have to choose again. And I don't know if I can survive another time when you choose wrong. Then let me prove it. Give me another chance. She paused in the doorway, her back to him. I'm not saying never. I'm saying not now. Maybe not for a long time. But I need you to understand something, Cassian. What? If we ever try again, it has to be different. Not you protecting me, not me depending on you, but equals building something together where trust isn't conditional on perfect evidence or flawless behavior. Where we choose each other even when it's terrifying. I want that, more than anything. Then earn it. Not with grand gestures or expensive gifts or public declarations, but with the quiet work of becoming someone I can trust absolutely, even when you're afraid. Seraphine left without looking back, and Cassian stood alone in the drawing room, understanding exactly how far he'd fallen. He'd spent his life building an empire on the principle that power was the only currency that mattered. That strength meant never showing vulnerability. That attachment was weakness waiting to be exploited. And in a single night of fear, he'd proven every one of those principles catastrophically wrong. Power meant nothing without trust to wield it responsibly. Strength was worthless if you couldn't recognize when you were being manipulated. And attachment wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that had ever made him stronger. Now he had to figure out if he could rebuild what he'd destroyed. If Seraphine would ever trust him again. If love was enough to bridge the gap between who he'd been and who he needed to become. The answer terrified him, because for the first time in his life, Cassian Viramont had encountered a problem he couldn't solve through intelligence or wealth or ruthless determination. He'd destroyed something that could only be repaired through time, patience, and the agonizing work of proving he'd changed in ways that couldn't be measured or quantified. And he had no idea if he was capable of it. Outside, London continued its eternal machinations, indifferent to the collapse of one man's certainty. Inside, Cassian stood at the window and faced the most terrifying question of his life. Who was he without the armor of absolute control? Without the certainty that he could command outcomes through force of will? Without the woman who'd taught him that partnership was stronger than possession? He didn't know. And that uncertainty, that complete loss of the foundations he'd built his identity on, was the beginning of either his destruction or his transformation. The choice was his. But this time, he couldn't simply decide and make it so. This time, he had to become someone worthy of the choice Seraphine might eventually make. And that required changing everything he'd ever believed about power, trust, and what it actually meant to love someone beyond possession. The transformation didn't come with fanfare or sudden revelation. It came in the quiet hours when Cassian sat alone in rooms that felt too large without Seraphine's presence. It came in the moments when he caught himself reaching for absolute control and forced his hands to remain still. It came in the agonizing work of dismantling everything he'd believed about power and rebuilding it from foundations he didn't fully understand yet. 3 months after Seraphine left, Cassian stood in his study reviewing documents that would reshape his entire financial empire. Not because he had to, because it was the right thing to do. James Rutherford sat across from him, confusion evident on his face. You want to transfer controlling interest in 12 of your companies to independent boards? Yes. That's insane. You'll lose direct control over nearly 40% of your holdings. I know. Cassian signed the first document with steady hands. But direct control is what allowed Marcus to steal millions without anyone questioning it. Distributed oversight prevents that. It also prevents you from making unilateral decisions, from acting quickly when opportunities emerge. Good. Maybe I need to learn to trust other people's judgment instead of assuming mine is always superior. James stared at him like he'd grown a second head. Who are you, and what have you done with Cassian Viramont? I'm the man trying to become someone worthy of a second chance. Even if that chance never comes. The restructuring took 6 weeks to implement. 6 weeks of watching his absolute authority fragment into collaborative decision-making. 6 weeks of learning to ask instead of command. 6 weeks of understanding that strength didn't mean controlling every variable, but knowing which ones actually mattered. It was excruciating. It was humbling. It was necessary. Because the philosophical truth that had eluded him his entire life was finally crystallizing. Power without accountability was just tyranny wearing expensive suits. Control without trust was prison built from paranoia. And love without vulnerability was just possession dressed in prettier language. He'd spent 15 years being the man no one could manipulate because he trusted no one completely. And in protecting himself from betrayal, he'd guaranteed that when it finally came, he'd be completely unprepared to recognize it. Marcus had exploited that, had understood that Cassian's deepest fear was being made a fool of by someone he cared about, had crafted a scenario so perfect that Cassian had destroyed his marriage rather than question the evidence. Never again. The vow echoed through every decision Cassian made, every restructuring, every moment when he chose collaboration over control, every instance when fear whispered that vulnerability was weakness, and he pushed forward anyway. He was becoming someone new, someone he didn't fully recognize yet, someone who might eventually deserve the chance Seraphine had said she couldn't give. But transformation took time, and time was the one thing Cassian couldn't command or accelerate, so he waited, and worked, and changed. The first contact came from Victoria Hartford 4 months after Seraphine had walked out. Cassian received her at his townhouse with the wariness of a man who'd learned that assumptions were dangerous. She settled into the drawing room with her characteristic directness. "She wants to see you," Victoria said without preamble. Cassian's heart stuttered, hope and terror warring in his chest. "When?" "Tomorrow, 2 o'clock, at the sanctuary." The sanctuary Seraphine had built. Neutral ground, or perhaps a test to see if he could walk into her territory without trying to dominate it. "I'll be there." "Good." Victoria stood to leave, then paused. "You should know. She's different now. Stronger. More certain of herself. If you try to overwhelm her with grand gestures or declarations, she'll walk away and never come back." "Noted. And Cassian?" Victoria's expression softened slightly. "I've watched you these past months. Heard about the restructuring, the changes you're making. It's impressive. Whether it's enough remains to be seen, but it's more than most men would attempt." After she left, Cassian sat alone with the weight of what was coming. Tomorrow he'd face Seraphine for the first time in 4 months. 4 months of transformation that might mean nothing if he couldn't prove it was genuine. 4 months of becoming someone new that would be tested in a single conversation. The stakes had never been higher. Not when he'd built his first company. Not when he'd faced down Parliament over financial reforms. Not even when he'd confronted Edmund and dismantled his world. Because this time, he wasn't fighting for power or wealth or reputation. He was fighting for the only thing that had ever actually mattered. The chance to love someone who'd learned to exist without needing him. The sanctuary occupied a converted townhouse in Chelsea. Its exterior understated, but its interior warm and welcoming. Cassian had never actually visited, had only funded it from a distance while Seraphine and Victoria managed the day-to-day operations. Walking through the doors felt like entering foreign territory. A young woman at the front desk looked up, her expression shifting from professional welcome to wary recognition. "Your Grace, Lady Seraphine is expecting you. 2nd floor, 3rd door on the left." Cassian climbed stairs that felt steeper than they were, each step heavy with possibility and consequence. He found the door. Knocked. Waited for permission that might not come. "Come in." Her voice hit him like a physical force, familiar and strange all at once. He opened the door to find Seraphine standing by a window, backlit by afternoon sun. She turned, and Cassian felt his breath catch. Victoria was right. She looked different. Not diminished by their separation, but refined. Like she'd been tested by fire and emerged tempered instead of broken. "Hello, Cassian," she said quietly. "Seraphine." He stayed near the door, unwilling to presume proximity. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I wasn't sure I would, but Victoria said you'd changed. I needed to see for myself whether that was true." "And?" "I don't know yet. Sit." They settled into chairs near the window, careful distance between them. Cassian waited for her to begin, remembering Victoria's warning about overwhelming her. "I've been hearing things," Seraphine said, "about the restructuring, the board appointments, the shift from unilateral control to collaborative oversight. It was necessary." "Why?" You built your empire on absolute control. Why abandon it now? Because absolute control is what made me vulnerable to Marcus, and what made me destroy us when fear told me to. Cassian met her gaze steadily. I'm learning that strength isn't about controlling every variable. It's about knowing which battles actually matter and trusting others with the rest. Pretty words. Do you believe them? I'm trying to. Some days more successfully than others. Seraphine studied him with the analytical precision he'd always admired. What else has changed? I fired my entire personal security team and hired a new one with instructions to protect rather than intimidate. I've started attending therapy twice a week to understand why I default to control when I'm afraid. I sold the estate where Edmund used to live because keeping it felt like maintaining a trophy from your pain. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I've been learning to sit with uncertainty instead of trying to eliminate it, to accept that I can't guarantee outcomes through force of will, to trust that some things are worth the risk even when they terrify me, such as you, us. The possibility that love requires vulnerability more than it requires power. Seraphine's expression flickered, something painful crossing her features. You hurt me, Cassian, not just by accusing me, but by proving that when you were tested, you chose fear over faith, evidence over instinct, control over trust. I know, and I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover the damage I caused. No, it doesn't. She looked out the window. I spent 4 months asking myself if I could ever trust you again, if the man I fell in love with was real or just another performance, if your transformation now is genuine or just strategy to get back what you lost. What did you decide? That I don't know. And that uncertainty is something I have to live with if I want to even consider giving us another chance. The words hung between them, fragile and weighted. Cassian felt hope flare alongside terror. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't reconciliation. This was the possibility of both, contingent on his ability to prove he'd changed in ways that couldn't be faked. Tell me what you need, he said. What would convince you that this is real? Time, consistency. Proof that when you're afraid again, when evidence suggests I'm betraying you again, you'll choose to trust me instead of destroying us. How do I prove that without the test actually happening? You can't. That's the point. Seraphine turned back to face him. Trust isn't something you can demonstrate through grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices. It's built through hundreds of small moments where you choose faith over fear. And I don't know if you're capable of that. The assessment stung because it was fair. Cassian had spent his life proving himself through decisive action and overwhelming force. The quiet work of consistent trust was foreign territory. Then let me try, he said, not as your husband, not with any expectations or demands, just as someone who wants to prove he's learned from the worst mistake of his life. What does that look like? I don't know. You tell me. Seraphine was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. We start over, not where we were, but from the beginning. You court me, properly, with transparency and honesty, and absolutely no assumptions about outcomes. Right? And I get to set the pace, the boundaries, the terms. You don't push, don't manipulate, don't try to accelerate things because you're impatient or afraid. I'll change my mind. Agreed. And if at any point I decide this isn't working, that I can't trust you the way I need to, you accept it. No fighting, no grand gestures to change my mind, just acceptance. The terms were harsh but fair. Cassian would be giving up all control, all certainty, all ability to command the outcome. Everything in him that had been trained to dominate and direct screamed against it, which was exactly why he needed to agree. Yes, he said, whatever you need, however long it takes. Seraphine studied him, searching for the angle, the manipulation, the hidden price. Cassian let her look, keeping his expression open and honest in ways that felt more vulnerable than being physically naked. All right, she said finally. We try. But Cassian, you need to understand something. What? If you hurt me like that again, if you choose fear over us one more time, there won't be another chance. I'll walk away and never look back. Because I'd rather spend my life alone than spend it with someone who destroys me every time he gets scared. I understand. Good. Then we start Monday. Dinner. Public. No expectations beyond conversation. I'll be there. Seraphine stood, signaling the meeting's end. Cassian rose as well, every instinct screaming to pull her close, to kiss her, to reclaim what he'd lost. He forced himself to remain still. Thank you, he said instead. "For giving me this chance. Don't thank me yet. You haven't earned anything, just the opportunity to try. It's more than I deserve." "Yes, it is." She walked him to the door, and as Cassian left the sanctuary, he felt the weight of what he'd just committed to settling over him like armor. This wouldn't be easy, wouldn't be quick, wouldn't follow any of the patterns he'd used to build his empire or win his battles. This would require patience, humility, and the constant choice to trust instead of control. Everything he'd spent his life avoiding. Everything he needed to learn if he wanted to become someone worthy of Seraphine's faith. Boom. The courting that followed was excruciating in its restraint. Monday dinners became routine, public venues where conversation stayed carefully neutral. Seraphine asked questions. Cassian answered honestly. They discussed books, politics, the sanctuary's growth, her publishing ventures. Everything except the elephant sitting at every table between them. Whether this was working, whether trust was rebuilding, whether they had a future. 6 weeks in, Victoria pulled Cassian aside after he'd dropped Seraphine at her townhouse. "You're doing well," she said. "Better than I expected. Is she softening at all?" "I wouldn't know. She doesn't discuss you with me beyond confirming she's still willing to continue these dinners. That's not exactly encouraging. It's not meant to be." Victoria's expression was stern. "You destroyed something precious. Rebuilding it takes time, and there's no guarantee you'll succeed." "I know. Do you? Because I watch you at these dinners. I see the restraint it takes for you not to push, not to demand more, not to try to accelerate the process. It's the hardest thing I've ever done." "Good. That means it matters enough to be worth doing right." After Victoria left, Cassian sat in his carriage and faced the brutal reality of his situation. He was 8 weeks into courting his own wife. 8 weeks of careful conversations and deliberate distance. 8 weeks of proving he could exist in uncertainty without trying to eliminate it. And he had no idea if it was enough, if it would ever be enough, if Seraphine was healing or just going through motions until she could definitively say she'd tried. The philosophical question that haunted him was whether change without external validation meant anything. If he was becoming a better man in isolation, with no guarantee it would be recognized or rewarded, was the transformation genuine? Or was it just another form of strategy? Deferred gratification dressed as personal growth. He didn't have answers. Only the daily choice to keep trying, keep changing, keep proving that he could be patient when every instinct screamed for resolution. It was agony. It was necessary. It was the price of his failures. The crisis came in week 10. Cassian received word that Marcus Thorne had been located in Monaco, living under a false identity but trackable through financial patterns he'd been unable to completely obscure. The authorities were prepared to move, but they needed Cassian's cooperation to build a case strong enough for extradition. James brought him the news with barely contained excitement. "We can get him. Bring him back. Recover at least some of what he stole and see him prosecuted." Cassian stared at the documents detailing Marcus's location and activities, feeling old instincts surge. The desire to pursue, to punish, to prove that betrayal carried consequences. But pursuing Marcus meant weeks of attention devoted to legal proceedings instead of rebuilding trust with Seraphine, meant public scrutiny and press coverage that would drag their private pain back into the spotlight, meant choosing revenge over reconstruction. The old Cassian wouldn't have hesitated, would have pursued Marcus to the ends of the earth and made his destruction a public spectacle. The man he was becoming had different priorities. "Let it go," Cassian said. James blinked. "What?" I said, "Let it go. Tell the authorities they can proceed without my direct involvement. If they need statements or documentation, I'll provide it. But I'm not devoting months to chasing a man who's already irrelevant. He stole millions from you, tried to destroy your marriage. You're just going to let him walk? He didn't succeed. The money's replaceable. The marriage is what matters. And pursuing him would mean choosing revenge over rebuilding." Cassian set down the documents. "I'm done letting fear and anger dictate my choices. This isn't fear or anger, this is justice. No, this is me learning that some battles aren't worth fighting when they cost you what you're actually fighting for." James looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Victoria was right. "You have changed." "Yes, I have. Now tell the authorities to proceed without me and close that chapter." After James left, Cassian sat alone with the magnitude of what he'd just chosen. Marcus would likely escape prosecution without Cassian's direct involvement, would live out his days in comfortable exile on stolen money, would never face full consequences for his betrayal. The old Cassian would have found that intolerable. The new Cassian understood that holding on to rage meant losing what actually mattered. He told Seraphine about the decision that night over dinner. "You let him go?" She looked stunned. "Yes." "Why?" "Because pursuing him would have meant devoting months to revenge instead of this. Instead of us. Instead of proving I've learned what matters." Seraphine set down her wine glass, her expression unreadable. I don't know what to say. Say, you see that I'm trying, that I'm choosing differently than I would have a year ago, that the man who destroyed us over Marcus's lies is becoming someone who won't let Marcus's freedom destroy us again. I see it. She reached across the table, her hand covering his. For the first time in 10 weeks, she initiated contact. "I see you trying, and it means more than you know." Her touch was electric, familiar and foreign all at once. Cassian forced himself not to grip too tight, not to pull her closer, not to push for more than she was offering. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for seeing it, for giving me the chance to prove it. Don't make me regret it. I won't. I promise." They finished dinner with their hands still connected across the table, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, Cassian felt something other than despair. Hope. Fragile, uncertain, but real. The breakthrough came in week 14. Seraphine invited Cassian to the sanctuary's fundraising gala, not as her husband, but as a significant donor. He arrived to find the space transformed, filled with London's elite who'd chosen to support women's empowerment despite the scandal of its origins. Seraphine worked the room with practiced grace, and Cassian watched from the periphery, content to observe rather than dominate. She'd grown into her power in ways that took his breath away. Confident, commanding, completely in control of her domain. This was what he'd wanted for her from the beginning. Not a rescued woman dependent on his protection, but someone who'd claimed her own authority and wielded it with precision. Halfway through the evening, a man approached Seraphine with obvious intentions. Expensive suit, practiced charm, the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. Cassian felt jealousy flare hot and immediate. Watched the man lean too close, his hand finding Seraphine's lower back in a gesture that was too familiar for strangers. Every instinct screamed to intervene, to cross the room and make clear that she was his, to eliminate the threat through presence and intimidation. Cassian forced himself to remain still. This was the test, whether he could trust Seraphine to handle herself, whether he could exist in uncertainty without trying to eliminate it through control. He watched Seraphine smile at the man, watched her step back, removing his hand with subtle precision, watched her speak words that made the man's smile falter and his posture deflate. She didn't need rescue, didn't need protection. She was handling herself perfectly. And when she glanced across the room and caught Cassian's eye, seeing him standing still instead of charging forward, her expression shifted. Something like approval, something like recognition. After the gala, as Cassian prepared to leave, Seraphine pulled him aside. "You didn't interfere," she said. "No." "Why not?" "I saw your face." "You wanted to." "Yes. But you didn't need me to. And inserting myself would have been about making me feel better, not protecting you." Cassian met her gaze. "You're not mine to protect from men who can't take a hint. You're your own person who can handle herself." Seraphina stepped closer, and Cassian's heart raced. "That's the first time you've ever truly meant that. I've always said it. Saying and believing are different things." She reached up, her hand cupping his face. "Tonight you proved you believe it." Then she kissed him. Not tentatively, not testing, but with the kind of certainty that came from making a choice freely instead of being pushed into it. Cassian kissed her back, pouring into it 14 weeks of restraint and transformation and desperate hope. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Take me home," Seraphine whispered. "Are you sure?" "No, but I'm choosing anyway. Isn't that what you taught me freedom means?" They left together, and in the carriage ride back to the townhouse, Cassian felt like he was being given something infinitely precious. Not possession, not ownership, but the freely given choice of someone who'd learned she could exist without him and decided she didn't want to. The reunion that night was different from anything they'd shared before. Not desperate, not claiming, but deliberate. Two people choosing each other with full knowledge of the costs and consequences, with complete awareness that this could still fall apart if fear won over faith. Afterward, tangled together in sheets that smelled like home, Seraphine spoke into the darkness. "I'm still afraid," she said. "So am I. What if you break my trust again? Then you'll leave and I'll have to live with that consequence. But I'm choosing to believe I won't. That I've learned enough to recognize manipulation when it comes. That I trust you absolutely, even when evidence suggests otherwise. That's a big promise. I know. But it's true." Cassian pulled her closer. "You could walk out tomorrow and I'd still believe this was worth trying, worth risking, worth changing everything I thought I knew about power and control. Why? Because you taught me that strength isn't about dominating outcomes. It's about having the courage to be vulnerable even when it terrifies you. And loving you terrifies me more than anything I've ever faced." "Good." Seraphine's voice held warmth. "Fear means you know what you could lose. Means it matters enough to be worth protecting." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and for the first time in 4 months, Cassian felt complete. But completion was fragile, and the universe had a way of testing whether transformation was genuine or just temporary performance. The test came 3 weeks later in the form of documents that landed on Cassian's desk with the weight of catastrophe. Financial records showing Seraphine moving money again, meeting with the same offshore banking contacts Marcus had used, building structures that looked identical to the ones that had nearly destroyed them. James delivered the information with visible reluctance. "I need to show you this, and I need you to not react the way you did last time." Cassian looked at the documents, feeling ice settle in his veins. The patterns were identical, the methodology the same, even the amounts tracked with what Marcus had stolen. Every instinct screamed betrayal. Every fear roared that he'd been played again. Every bit of hard-won trust crumbled under the weight of evidence that looked irrefutable. But Cassian had spent 4 months learning to question his instincts, to challenge his fears, to trust instead of control. He set down the documents with hands that wanted to shake. "This isn't real," he said. "How do you know?" "Because Seraphine wouldn't. Because I trust her absolutely even when evidence suggests otherwise. Because I learned what happens when I choose fear over faith." "Cassian, these are verified records. I've checked them 3 times. Then they're fabricated. Someone is trying to destroy us again. And this time I'm not falling for it." James stared at him. "You're certain?" "No. I'm terrified. But I'm choosing trust anyway." Cassian stood. "Find out who's actually behind this. I'll talk to Seraphine and give her the chance to explain before I assume anything. This could be a massive mistake. Then it's mine to make. But I'd rather be wrong about trusting her than right about destroying us." He went to Seraphine immediately, walking into her publishing office without announcement. She looked up from her desk, her expression shifting from surprise to concern when she saw his face. "What happened?" Cassian laid out the documents, showed her the evidence, watched her face go pale as she processed what she was seeing. "Someone's framing me again," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook, making it look like I'm doing exactly what I was accused of before. "I know." She looked up sharply. "You believe me? Just like that?" "Yes. Because I trust you, even when evidence suggests I shouldn't, even when every fear I have is screaming otherwise." Cassian moved around the desk, taking her hands. "I'm not making the same mistake twice." Tears welled in Seraphine's eyes. "You mean that?" "Absolutely. Now help me figure out who's actually doing this so we can end them." They worked together, tearing apart the fabricated evidence with combined intelligence and determination. Within hours, they'd traced the documents back to their source, Edmund's cousin, Margaret Thornbury. The woman who'd confronted Seraphine at the gallery years ago, who'd never forgiven the scandal that had destroyed Edmund, who'd apparently spent 2 years planning revenge elaborate enough to destroy what Marcus had failed to. The revelation was both clarifying and enraging. "She's been planning this for years," Seraphine said, staring at the evidence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "And she chose now because we were finally rebuilding." Cassian's voice was cold. "She wanted to destroy us when we had the most to lose. So what do? We end her. Publicly. Completely. So thoroughly that no one ever tries this again." Seraphine looked at him. and something fierce burned in her eyes. Together, together. Wolves. The confrontation happened at Margaret Thornbury's own estate, in front of witnesses who included law enforcement and members of Parliament. Cassian and Seraphine arrived united, and the sight of them together clearly rattled Margaret. She'd been expecting division, expecting the same breakdown that had nearly destroyed them 4 months ago. Instead, she got a partnership forged in fire and tempered by hard-won trust. "Mrs. Thornbury," Cassian said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "you've been systematically fabricating financial documents to frame my wife for embezzlement. We have proof, complete documentation of every forged signature, every fabricated transaction, every moment you thought you were clever enough to destroy us." Margaret's face went white, then red. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie." Seraphine's voice cut like a blade. "We've traced everything back to you, the offshore accounts, the shell companies, even the banking contacts you used. It's over. You destroyed Edmund. You humiliated my family. You deserved—" "I survived Edmund," Seraphine interrupted. "I refuse to be destroyed by a man who treated me like property. That's not a crime. But what you've done? Fraud. Forgery. Attempted frame for embezzlement. Those are actual crimes, with actual consequences." The authorities moved forward, and Margaret realized too late that this wasn't a confrontation. It was an arrest. As they led her away, she screamed accusations and threats, promised she'd fight, swore they'd regret this. Cassian and Seraphine stood together watching, their hands linked. "It's done," Cassian said quietly. "Yes. Finally." They left Margaret's estate to face a gathered crowd of press and onlookers. Questions shouted from all directions, cameras flashing, the machinery of scandal grinding back to life. Cassian turned to Seraphine. "Do we say anything?" She looked at him, a question in her eyes. He nodded. This was her choice to make. Seraphine stepped forward, and the crowd quieted. "For years, I've been the subject of scandal and speculation, people questioning my choices, my marriage, my character." She paused, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "I'm done defending myself to people who've decided I'm guilty, regardless of evidence. What you just witnessed is the arrest of a woman who spent 2 years trying to destroy my life out of misplaced loyalty to a man who destroyed his own." She took Cassian's hand, holding it high. "This is my husband, my partner, my choice freely made and freely continued, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with both of us. Together." The crowd erupted with questions, but Seraphine turned away, pulling Cassian with her. They walked to their carriage through chaos, and inside the privacy of enclosed space, they finally let themselves breathe. "That was terrifying," Seraphine said. "You were magnificent. We were magnificent." She turned to face him. "You trusted me, even when evidence said not to, even when it would have been easier to believe the worst. I learned my lesson. Nothing is worth losing you over. Not fear, not evidence, not the comfortable certainty of absolute control." "Good. Because I need you to keep learning it. Keep choosing trust even when it's hard. Keep being vulnerable even when it terrifies you." "I will. Every day. For the rest of our lives if you'll let me." Seraphine kissed him, and it tasted like forgiveness and promise, and the hard-won certainty of people who'd been tested and survived. When they broke apart, she smiled. "Take me home." "To the townhouse?" "No. To our home. The one we build together, where trust matters more than control, and partnership means choosing each other even when the world tells us not to." Cassian pulled her close, feeling something settle in his chest that had been fractured for months. They'd survived betrayal, survived doubt, survived the complete collapse of everything they'd built and the agonizing work of rebuilding from scorched earth. And they'd done it together. Not because it was easy, not because they were perfect, but because they'd learned that love without trust was just possession, that power without vulnerability was just tyranny, and that the only battles worth fighting were the ones that protected what actually mattered. The carriage rolled through London as twilight settled over the city, and inside, 2 people who'd learned to survive alone remembered what it felt like to choose partnership. The empire Cassian had built still stood. The sanctuary Seraphine had created still thrived. The publishing house still challenged conventions. But the real victory was smaller, more personal, more precious. They'd learned to trust each other absolutely, even when evidence suggested otherwise, even when fear screamed to protect themselves through control. And that trust, hard-won and carefully maintained, was the foundation everything else would be built on. Not perfect, not without risk, but genuine in ways that couldn't be faked or forced. As the carriage pulled up to the townhouse, Cassian looked at Seraphine and saw his future. Not as something to control or command, but as something to build together through hundreds of small choices to trust instead of dominate. "Ready?" he asked. "For what?" "Whatever comes next. Together." Seraphine smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd survived hell and emerged stronger. Always. They walked into the townhouse hand in hand, and the door closed behind them on one chapter of their story. But outside, in the gathering darkness, new forces were already moving. Margaret Thornbury might be in custody, but her arrest had exposed something neither Cassian nor Seraphine had anticipated. Financial records subpoenaed for the prosecution revealed connections to a network far larger than one vengeful woman. Edmund's family had been systematically planning revenge for 3 years. Margaret was just the opening move, and the real attack was about to begin. The revelation came at dawn when James Rutherford arrived at the townhouse with documents that painted a picture far more sinister than anyone had anticipated. Cassian and Seraphine sat together in the study as their man of business spread evidence across the desk, with hands that trembled slightly. Margaret Thornbury wasn't acting alone, James said. She was the visible piece of something much larger. Edmund's entire family has been coordinating for 3 years, pooling resources, building cases, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy everything you've built. How bad is it? Cassian's voice was steady, but his hand found Seraphine's under the table. James laid out the scope with clinical precision. 18 separate legal actions filed simultaneously across 3 jurisdictions. Fraud allegations against your financial holdings. Embezzlement charges against the sanctuary. Claims that Seraphine's publishing house is a front for money laundering. They've coordinated with corrupt officials, manufactured evidence, and built a web designed to strangle you both through litigation, even if nothing sticks criminally. Seraphine stared at the documents, her face pale, but composed. This is coordinated destruction. They're not trying to win individual cases. They're trying to drown us in legal fees and public scandal until we have nothing left. Exactly. James pointed to financial projections. Even with your resources, defending against this many simultaneous actions would cost tens of millions. Take years. And the publicity alone would destroy both your reputations regardless of outcomes. The philosophical weight of what they faced settled over the room like smoke. This was the reality of power that people rarely acknowledged. Strength wasn't just about having resources. It was about being willing to deploy them completely, to wage total war, knowing that victory might cost everything worth protecting. The Alcott family had learned from Edmund's failure. They weren't attacking with incompetence and rage. They were attacking with calculation and patience, understanding that even the strongest empire could be toppled if you struck at enough foundations simultaneously. Cassian had built his life on being untouchable, on having enough power that direct confrontation was suicide for his enemies. But the Alcotts had found the flaw in that armor. They weren't confronting him directly. They were bleeding him through 1,000 cuts, each one legal and documented and requiring response. "What are our options?" Seraphine asked. James looked grim. "Fight and win eventually, but lose years and millions in the process. Settle and let them dictate terms, which would mean giving up significant portions of what you've built. Or go nuclear and destroy them so completely they can't continue the assault." "Define nuclear," Cassian said. "Expose everything, every crime, every corruption, every skeleton in every closet of everyone involved. Release it all publicly and let the resulting scandal consume them." James paused. "But that means becoming exactly what they're accusing you of being, ruthless, willing to destroy families and lives to protect your own interests." The choice hung in the air between them. Cassian felt Seraphine's hand tighten on his, felt her steady presence beside him, and understood with sudden clarity what mattered. Not revenge, not domination, not proving he was untouchable, just protecting what they'd built together. The sanctuary saving women from the same hell Seraphine had endured. The publishing house giving voice to perspectives society tried to silence. The partnership they'd forged through fire and betrayal and hard-won trust. That was worth fighting for. Worth defending with everything he had, but not worth becoming a monster to protect. "There's a fourth option," Cassian said quietly. "What?" We expose their coordination and corruption without destroying the individuals. We make public the manufactured evidence, the bribed officials, the systematic fraud. We prove the conspiracy and let justice handle the rest. Surgical precision instead of scorched earth. That's risky. Some might escape consequences. The legal battles could still drag on. Yes. But we won't become what they're accusing us of being, won't sacrifice our principles to win a war that's ultimately about principle. Cassian looked at Seraphine. What do you think? She was quiet for a long moment, her analytical mind processing options and consequences. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. I think we spent too long learning to trust each other to throw it away by becoming people we can't respect. We fight clean. We win on merit. And if that costs us more time and money, so be it. At least we'll still recognize ourselves when it's over. Cassian felt something settle in his chest. Pride. Love. The certainty that he'd chosen the right partner for all the right reasons. Then that's what we do. James, compile everything we have. Build an airtight case proving conspiracy and fraud. We'll release it through proper channels and let the legal system do what it's supposed to do. And if the system fails? If they escape consequences? Then we've still won. Because we protected what matters without losing ourselves in the process. James nodded slowly, gathering his documents. I'll have a preliminary report within 48 hours. This is going to get ugly before it gets better. After he left, Seraphine turned to Cassian with eyes that held both fear and determination. Are we really doing this? She asked. Fighting the entire Alcott family without going for the throat? Yes, because if we become monsters to defeat them, they've already won. We'll be proving everything they've accused us of, even if it costs us everything, even then. Because everything means nothing if we can't look at each other and see people we actually respect. Seraphine kissed him, and it tasted like shared conviction and mutual understanding. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. I love you, she said, not despite this choice. Because of it, I love you too, and I promise whatever comes next, we face it together. The counterattack launched 72 hours later with the precision of a military operation. James had compiled a dossier that was devastating in its completeness. Bank records showing coordination between 17 members of the Alcott family, communications proving manufactured evidence, financial transfers to corrupt officials. The entire conspiracy laid bare with documentation so thorough that denial was impossible. They released it not to tabloids or gossip sheets, but to law enforcement and investigative journalists simultaneously. Let the machinery of justice grind forward with the full weight of evidence behind it. The response was immediate and catastrophic for the Alcotts. 5 arrests within 24 hours. Parliamentary investigations launched. Financial assets frozen pending criminal review. The coordinated attack that had seemed so overwhelming collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. But victory came with costs. The publicity was brutal. Every newspaper ran stories about the Alcott conspiracy, but they also dredged up every detail of Cassian and Seraphine's history. The original scandal, Edmund's trial, Marcus Thorne's betrayal, Margaret's arrest. It all got rehashed and analyzed and dissected for public consumption. The sanctuary's donors started withdrawing support, afraid of association with ongoing scandal. Seraphine's publishing house saw 3 authors pull their contracts. Cassian's business partners began distancing themselves from ventures bearing his name. They were winning the legal battle, but losing the court of public opinion. Seraphine sat in her office, surrounded by cancellation notices and withdrawal letters, her face drawn with exhaustion. We did the right thing, she said, but it sounded like she was trying to convince herself. We did, Cassian confirmed. Consequences don't change that. Tell that to the 20 women currently in the sanctuary who might lose their housing because our donors are fleeing. Then we fund it ourselves, directly. Cut out the donors, who were only there for appearances anyway. That's millions of pounds annually. I know. We can afford it. For how long? Seraphine gestured at the financial reports showing the cumulative damage, the legal fees, the lost business, the ongoing costs of defending against lawsuits that haven't been dismissed yet. We're hemorrhaging money, Cassian. At this rate, we'll be significantly weakened within a year. The philosophical question that haunted all wielders of power echoed through the room. What good was having strength if maintaining it required becoming what you fought against? What value did victory hold if achieving it meant abandoning the principles that made winning worthwhile? Cassian had spent his life believing that power was the currency that mattered most. Now he understood that power without purpose was just elaborate self-destruction dressed in expensive suits. Then we get smaller, he said. Tighten operations, focus on what matters most. The sanctuary, your publishing house. The parts of our empire that actually change lives instead of just accumulating wealth. You'd give up half your holdings? I'd give up all of them if it meant keeping what we've built together intact. Money is replaceable. This isn't. Seraphine stared at him, and he saw her processing the magnitude of what he was offering. Not sacrifice as performance, not grand gesture designed to manipulate, just honest assessment of priorities and the willingness to act on them. That's not the man I met 2 years ago, she said quietly. No, he's dead. You killed him when you refused to be saved and insisted on saving yourself instead. Good. I like this version better. So do I. They spent the next 3 weeks systematically dismantling the empire Cassian had spent 15 years building, selling off holdings that were profitable but purposeless, consolidating resources into ventures that mattered, restructuring their entire financial foundation around sustainability instead of growth. It was surgical. It was painful. It was necessary. By the end, Cassian's net worth had dropped by nearly 40%. But the sanctuary was fully funded for the next decade. Seraphine's publishing house had the resources to weather any storm, and they'd created a foundation that could support both indefinitely without depending on donors who fled at the first hint of scandal. They were smaller, more focused, more vulnerable in some ways, but they were also more aligned with who they actually wanted to be. The trial of the Alcott conspiracy took 6 months to wind through the courts, and Cassian and Seraphine attended every day of proceedings. Not because they had to, because they wanted the family that had tried to destroy them to see exactly who they'd failed to break. The evidence was overwhelming. 17 family members faced charges ranging from fraud to conspiracy to bribery. The prosecution built their case with methodical precision, using the documentation James had compiled to prove systematic coordination. The defense tried everything: character assassination, claims of entrapment, suggestions that Cassian and Seraphine had manufactured evidence. None of it worked. The jury deliberated for 3 days and returned guilty verdicts on all major counts. Sentencing was harsh. Prison terms ranging from 2 to 12 years. Financial penalties that would bankrupt the Alcott family completely. Civil judgments that would prevent them from ever rebuilding. It was total victory. Complete vindication. Everything Cassian had fought for. And when the judge read the final sentence, he felt nothing but exhausted relief. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just the weary understanding that justice wasn't the same as healing, and winning didn't erase the damage inflicted along the way. Outside the courthouse, press swarmed with questions. Seraphine stepped forward, and Cassian stood beside her, letting her speak for them both. Today, justice was served, she said. But let's be clear about what that means. It doesn't undo the years Edmund Alcott spent destroying me. It doesn't return the money Marcus Thorne stole. It doesn't repair the relationships damaged by this family's vendetta. Justice is just accountability for past actions. Healing is something we have to build ourselves. A reporter shouted a question about whether they felt vindicated. Vindication suggests we needed external validation to know we were right. Seraphine's voice was firm. We didn't. We knew our truth. We fought to protect what mattered. The verdict just confirms what we already understood. That lies and corruption eventually collapse under their own weight. What's next for you and the Duke? We rebuild. Continue the sanctuary's work, publish books that challenge comfortable narratives, live our lives according to principles that matter more than public opinion. She took Cassian's hand. Together. They left the courthouse through crowds that couldn't decide whether to cheer or condemn. And Cassian understood that they'd always exist in that space. Too controversial for comfortable acceptance. Too principled for easy dismissal. It didn't matter. They had each other. They had purpose. They had principles worth defending. Everything else was just noise. Six months after the trial concluded, Cassian and Seraphine stood on the terrace of their townhouse watching London settle into evening. The city glittered below them, indifferent to their struggles, eternal in its grinding machinery of commerce and scandal. Victoria Hartford was inside hosting a small gathering. Not the elaborate affairs of London's elite, but an intimate dinner with the few people who'd stood by them through everything. James and his wife, a handful of authors from Seraphine's publishing house, 3 women who'd found safety in the sanctuary and stayed to help run it. The people who mattered, the ones who'd chosen to remain when remaining required actual courage. "Do you regret it?" Seraphine asked. "Everything you gave up, everything it cost." Cassian considered the question with the honesty it deserved. He'd lost half his fortune, sacrificed business relationships built over decades, endured months of public scrutiny that had stripped away any illusion of privacy, been tested in ways that had nearly broken him. But he'd also gained something infinitely more valuable. "Not once," he said, "because what I lost was just money and reputation. What I kept was you, us, the ability to look in a mirror and recognize the person staring back." That's a very different answer than you would have given 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I didn't understand the difference between power and strength, between controlling outcomes and having the courage to face them. Cassian pulled her close. "I thought empire was the measure of success. Now I know it's just elaborate distraction from what actually matters, which is this, you. The quiet certainty of having someone who sees all your flaws and chooses you anyway. The knowledge that you've been tested by fire and emerged tempered instead of broken." Seraphine rested her head against his shoulder. "We did emerge broken, several times. Yes, but we put ourselves back together. That's the difference. Edmund broke me and I stayed broken because I didn't know I could be anything else. You broke me and I learned to rebuild stronger. I never wanted to break you. I know. But growth requires breaking first, shedding what doesn't work, becoming uncomfortable enough in old patterns that you're willing to try new ones." Cassian's voice was quiet, reflective. "You taught me that protection isn't possession, that partnership means trusting someone to handle themselves. That love requires vulnerability more than it requires control. And you taught me that I was worth protecting. That strength doesn't mean enduring alone. That asking for help isn't weakness if it comes from choice instead of desperation." They stood together in the gathering dusk, 2 people who'd found each other through scandal and survived through stubborn determination to become better than their worst moments. Inside, laughter drifted from the dining room where their small circle of chosen family gathered. Not the elite of London society, not the powerful and connected. Just people who'd proven their loyalty through action instead of words. "Tell me something," Seraphine said, "if you could go back. Change any of it, would you?" Cassian thought about the question that had haunted him through every moment of transformation. Would he trade the pain for easier paths? Accept comfortable lies instead of confronting hard truths? Choose power without accountability over strength earned through failure? The philosophical answer was complex. Pain taught lessons that comfort never could. Failure revealed character in ways success obscured. Every moment of agony and doubt and near destruction had been necessary to become someone worthy of what they'd built together. "Not a single moment," he said finally, "because every mistake, every betrayal, every time I chose wrong and paid for it, they all led here. To you, to us, to understanding that the only empire worth building is the one you construct with someone you trust absolutely. Even Marcus? Even the moment you accused me? Especially those, because Marcus taught me that trust is vulnerability weaponized, and the only defense is choosing who you're vulnerable with. And accusing you taught me that fear is just love afraid of loss, and the solution isn't eliminating risk, but accepting it. That's very philosophical for a man who used to solve problems by throwing money at them." "I've had good teachers," Cassian smiled. "Mostly you. I didn't teach you anything. I just refused to let you hide behind power when what you needed was humanity. Same thing." They returned inside to join their gathering, and the evening unfolded with the comfortable rhythm of people who knew each other's stories and chose to remain anyway. Conversation flowed. Wine was poured. Laughter came easily. At one point, Victoria pulled Cassian aside with the expression of someone about to deliver uncomfortable truth. "You know they're still talking," she said. "The gossip circles, the society pages. Your name comes up at every gathering as either cautionary tale or aspirational story depending on who's telling it. Let them talk." Their opinions stopped mattering the moment I realized I'd spent 15 years courting people whose approval meant nothing. That's very zen for someone who used to destroy careers over perceived slights. I've evolved. Besides, destroying careers required caring what they thought of me. I don't anymore. Victoria studied him with sharp eyes. You've really changed. It's almost unsettling. Good. Means I'm finally becoming someone worth being instead of someone worth fearing. Can't you be both? Maybe. But I'd rather be someone Seraphine trusts absolutely than someone London fears completely. One matters. The other is just performance. After Victoria rejoined the party, Cassian found Seraphine in the library, looking at the shelf of books her publishing house had released. 13 titles now, each one challenging comfortable narratives about power, gender, and what strength actually looked like when stripped of traditional masculine performance. Proud of those? He asked. Proud doesn't cover it. These represent everything I never thought I could be. Every woman who read them and found permission to demand more. Every conversation they started that made someone question assumptions. She turned to face him. This is legacy. Not money or titles or social position, but actual impact on actual lives. You've built something remarkable. We've built something remarkable. You funded it, protected it, gave me space to make it real. You would have found a way regardless. That's who you are. Maybe. But it would have been harder, lonelier, less sustainable. Seraphine moved to him, her hands finding his. I need you to know something. What? I forgive you. For everything, the accusation, the doubt, the moment you chose fear over faith. I forgive you completely. Cassian felt something unlock in his chest that he hadn't realized was still clenched tight. Thank you. But more than that, I'm grateful for it. Because if you hadn't failed spectacularly, you wouldn't have learned what you needed to, and we wouldn't be here. We'd still be playing at partnership while you held all the actual power. So me destroying us was actually good for us? In the most painful way possible, yes. Sometimes we need to lose everything to understand what actually matters. You needed to lose me to realize I wasn't something you could possess or protect. I was someone you could only choose to stand beside. The truth of it settled over him with the weight of hard-won wisdom. She was right. His catastrophic failure had been the catalyst for actual transformation. Not performance, not strategy, but genuine change born from confronting his worst self and choosing to become better. I love you, he said. Not because you're beautiful or brilliant or brave, though you're all those things. I love you because you're the only person who's ever looked at me and seen someone worth becoming instead of someone to be intimidated by. I love you because you were willing to become that person. Most men would have stayed comfortable in power and blamed everyone else for the loneliness. You did the hard work of changing. They kissed in the library surrounded by books and evidence of transformation, and it tasted like forgiveness and promise and the quiet certainty of people who'd survived the worst and emerged stronger. When they rejoined the party, the evening was winding down, guests beginning to make departure noises. The comfortable end of time well spent among people who mattered. Cassian watched Seraphine move through the room, saying goodbyes and making plans for future gatherings, and felt profound gratitude for the path that had led here. Not the easy path, not the comfortable one, but the necessary journey through failure and betrayal and near destruction that had forged them both into people capable of this, of partnership built on trust instead of transaction, of love that required vulnerability instead of control, of strength that came from facing fears instead of eliminating them. After the last guest departed and staff had cleared away evidence of the gathering, Cassian and Seraphine returned to the terrace where the evening had begun. London spread below them, eternal and indifferent. A city that had witnessed their rise and fall and rise again. That would continue grinding forward long after they were gone, creating new scandals and new stories and new examples of what happened when power met humanity. Thank you, Cassian said into the quiet. For what? For not giving up on me. For insisting I become better instead of accepting me as I was. For loving me enough to walk away when I needed to learn that lesson. Thank you for learning it. For doing the hard work instead of just performing change. For proving that transformation is possible when someone cares enough to attempt it. They stood together in the darkness, two people who'd found each other through scandal and forged something real through shared determination to become worthy of what they'd built. The empire was smaller now, more focused, less impressive by traditional measures of wealth and influence. But it was theirs, built on principles that mattered, sustained by trust earned through failure and rebuilt through patience, defended not through ruthless domination, but through surgical precision and moral clarity. And standing there in the quiet of evening, Cassian understood what true power actually meant. Not the ability to control outcomes or dominate others or accumulate wealth without limit, but the strength to be vulnerable with someone you trusted absolutely. The courage to admit failure and learn from it. The wisdom to know that some things mattered more than victory. Seraphine. Partnership. Trust earned through hundreds of small choices to have faith instead of fear. That was the empire worth protecting, the legacy worth leaving, the story worth telling. Not a tale of domination and conquest, but a story of two broken people who found each other in the wreckage and chose to rebuild something better than what they'd lost. Together. Always together. The city glittered below them, indifferent to their quiet revolution. Inside, their home waited, warm, safe, built on foundations that would weather any storm because they were constructed from trust instead of control. Cassian pulled Seraphine close, and she melted into him with the ease of long practice and deep certainty. "Ready for whatever comes next?" he asked. "With you? Always. Even if it's more scandal, more betrayal, more moments when we're tested, especially then, because we've proven we can survive anything as long as we face it together." They went inside, leaving the terrace and the glittering city behind. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, new opportunities to choose trust over fear. But tonight was theirs. A moment of peace earned through surviving everything that had tried to destroy them. A quiet evening between people who knew each other's worst moments and chose to remain anyway. The empire Cassian had built was smaller now, but it was real. It was sustainable. It was aligned with principles worth defending. And standing beside Seraphine, watching her move through their home with confidence and grace and absolute certainty in her own worth, Cassian understood that he'd finally found what had eluded him for 15 years. Not power, not control, not the ability to dominate outcomes through force of will, but peace, purpose, partnership with someone who saw all his flaws and loved him anyway. That was the true measure of success, the only empire worth building, the legacy that would outlast any accumulation of wealth or influence. Two people choosing each other, every day, through every test, together. And in that choosing, that daily recommitment to partnership over possession and trust over control, they'd found something rarer than any fortune. They'd found home, not a place, but a person, a presence. The certainty that no matter what came next, they wouldn't face it alone. The story that had begun with scandal and possession had transformed into something infinitely more valuable. A partnership forged through failure, a love that required vulnerability, a strength built not from dominating others, but from trusting absolutely. And as London settled into night and their home filled with comfortable silence, Cassian Viramont and Seraphine stood together at the window watching their empire. Smaller now, more focused, less impressive by traditional measures, but theirs. Completely and absolutely theirs. Built on truth instead of lies, trust instead of control, love instead of possession. The only empire that had ever actually mattered. The only one worth protecting. The only one that would endure.